Chapter 3046. At that time, Qinshin was a doctor and a beautiful older brother. He had never seen such a good-looking person. From then on, he wanted to chase after her. He became a popular actor at King Entertainment. He wanted to get close to her. He knew her well enough to sleep in her apartment, but he knew that she was not interested in him. Qinshin had a mystery in his heart. This mystery was Lan Yu. He knew very well in his heart, but he had been watching over her silently. He knew that she was married to Lan Yu, and that the man had loved her for many years. But that man was not suitable for her. He always made her cry. Pei Jingyu's gaze was gentle until she disappeared from the ward. Perhaps he needed to wait for many years until she and Lan Yu were completely separated. He didn't care about waiting because he had waited for many years. Outside the door, Qin Shun was surrounded by reporters as soon as he walked out of the door. "Miss Qin, did you come just to see Pei Jingyu?" Qin Shun put on his sunglasses. "What does it have to do with you?" The reporters were in an uproar. It was still the same Qin Shun, the Qin Shun who never fawned over the media. However, Qin Shun still pushed open the door to Lan Yu's ward and closed it, blocking the reporters' cameras. Lan Yu was leaning against the headboard, reading some documents. When he heard the voice, he thought it was Kevin. "Give me a glass of water." Qin Shun walked over, poured a glass of water, and placed it by his bedside. When Lan Yu picked it up, he saw her hand. He looked up and saw that it was her. Qin Shun took a step back and sat on the sofa. He said calmly, "I feel ashamed for you to fight at your age. Do you feel sorry for your pretty boy?" he asked with a frown. Qin Shun smiled. "Lan Yu, if you think so, then so be it." She actually didn't care what he said. Lan Yu put down the glass of water and continued to look at the document. He asked calmly, "You came here just to say this?" "Of course not," Qin Shun said, taking out a document and handing it to him. "This is the divorce agreement." Lan Yu raised his eyes and looked at her for a moment before taking it. He took it and looked at it quietly. After a long time, he chuckled softly. "You're willing to leave the family with nothing?" Qin Shun said nothing. "But you took something from me." He threw down the document and assumed the posture of a superior. But that face was really not very beautiful. Qin Shun thought unkindly as he watched. However, Lan Yu said shamelessly to her with this face, "The gold I gave you may have already made you pregnant." Qin Shun gritted his teeth. "Don't you have any shame? You can say that I forced you, but I forced you every time, didn't I?" "Qin Shun, you should know it very well." He stared at her eyes. "In Rongyu, I will make a decision when the DNA result comes out." He looked at her eyes and said in a strong voice, "He is my son. I will not give up. I can divorce, but my son belongs to me." Qin Shun looked at him for a long time and asked softly, "If it is a marriage of 3 people, won't you feel crowded?" He thought she was talking about Lu Wei, so he said in a low voice, "She will not exist in our marriage." "I mean Jingyu," Qin Shun said lazily. "I quite like him if you don't mind." "Qin Shun, don't force me to do it." Lan Yu's voice was a little hoarse. Chapter 3047. She smiled and said, "Are you going to be enemies with the whole Qin family and the Tang family? I don't think Boss Lan can handle it." Lan Yu squinted and stared at her. "If I have to do it, I can tear your pretty boy in half even if I can't take down the Qin family. Are you jealous?" Qin Shun moved forward and reached out to touch his face. "Boss Lan, you're old. You should calm down." That was like a stab in his heart. Qin Shun kept saying that he was old. How was he old? Was there only that pretty boy in her heart now? He held her and squinted. "Can he satisfy you like I do?" "Dirty?" Qin Shun stared at him. "Lan Yu, what else can you do besides forcing women?" His expression suddenly became a little dazed. He suddenly said, "I've never forced anyone except you. Cher was my wife for a few years, and I never forced her if she didn't want to." Qin Shun sneered. "It sounds very loving, so you have to learn to let go like you did in the past." "Lan Yu, you don't know how to love anyone at all. You seem to have a lot of love, but none of them are what I want." What did she want? She wanted a man who believed in her completely. She didn't love Jingyu, but Jingyu's eyes made her feel at ease. When Jingyu looked at her, she would believe that the whole world had betrayed him, but he still believed that she wouldn't. That was trust. In Lan Yu's eyes, she only saw suspicion. She stood up and said softly, I'm a person who wants to fly. I can give up what I have because I love you. But if I don't love you and want to leave you, I can also give up a lot, including Rongyu. She was not selfish. She was gambling. He didn't really love Rongyu. He just wanted a chess piece to tie her down. After Qinshan said that, he walked out. Lanyu swept the cup on the bedside table, and the water splashed everywhere. 3 days later, Rongyu's DNA came out. Kevin sent him to Lanyu's office. After a few days, Lanyu had mostly recovered. Other than the bruises at the corners of his mouth, he had returned to his usual handsome appearance. "Chief Lan, you're out," Kevin said softly as he placed the things on the desk. Lanyu looked up, his gaze calm. After a while, he whispered, "You go out first." Kevin knew that his boss was not in a good mood. After all, as a man, how could he not be angry when his wife was with a little fresh meat all day long during his marriage? Paging you was getting more and more popular. Kevin chimed in, "Actually, boss, you don't have to worry too much about it. I feel that all of this is just King Entertainment's hype. Their CEO, Chin Mo, loves to do things like this. He wouldn't even let his own sister off. What a beast." Lanyu glanced at him. Kevin didn't dare to say anything else and left. Lanyu picked up the file on the table and opened it with an indifferent gaze. He took a few seconds to read the final result, and then his body froze. Rongyu was his son. Then everything that Huang Xia said was true. Qinshan was pregnant with his child when she married Rong Lei. How did she feel at that time? Lanyu closed his eyes and clenched his fists. When he found out the truth, she already hated him. Lanyu raised his head as Adam's apple moving. He wanted to see her now. Chapter 3048. When he opened his eyes, he took the DNA report and drove to her apartment. She was there alone. She opened the door and let him in. "It seems that you have made a decision," she said softly. Lanyu put the DNA report in front of her. "Rongyu is my son." Qinshan took it and glanced at it. Then she smiled. "Just the provider." Lanyu's face darkened. "Are you going to ignore this result? What else can I do?" Qinshan looked at him and said with a smile, "As far as I know, it's only a matter of tens of thousands of yuan if you buy from a bank. Boss Lan, do you want me to be grateful to you for tens of thousands of yuan?" He stared at her and sneered. "I've already hired a lawyer to draft the documents. If we divorce, I don't mind letting Rongyu follow me. Then I'll follow you. I can also inherit the Lan family's property in the future." "That's good," Qinshan said angrily. Lanyu glared at her. Suddenly, he pulled her over and pressed her down on the sofa. Junyan approached her and said in an extremely displeased voice, "Do you hate me that much?" Qinshan looked at the face that was close to him and said, "I don't hate you, but I can't agree with you." She said it in a gloomy tone. Lanyu narrowed his eyes. "Because of that little star? I told you that there's nothing between me and her." Qinshan struggled but couldn't get rid of him. She could only continue to be pressed down on the sofa by him. She turned her face away and said after a long time, "It's not just one thing, but many things. Lanyu, do you know that you're mentally ill? You think you love me, but you don't know how to love me. Your love will only make people want to run away." There was a trace of pain in his eyes. Qinshan continued, "Sorry, the truth is usually very hurtful." He let go of her. She sat up, her gaze calm. "In this wrong marriage, you could find a gentle girl to marry. Lanyu, don't let me become your inner demon. I don't want to dwell on the past." She had tried, but he had failed her. Lanyu closed his eyes slightly. "Are you so determined because of paging you?" "No, it's because of me." Qinshan let out a long sigh and looked at him. "It has nothing to do with him." Lanyu clenched his fists. "Have you slept with him?" Qinshan did not answer this question. He grasped her chin in one swift motion. Men always cared about this kind of thing. "Tell me, have you ever slept with him?" Lanyu's thin lips spat out a few words coldly. Qinshan frowned. "This has nothing to do with you." As soon as he said those words, he was forcefully kissed. He almost rudely touched her. As he did so, he panted and asked, "When did it happen?" "Huh?" Qinshan grabbed his hand and wanted to stop him, but he was really wild and kept doing it like that. Lanyu! Her brown hair spread on the white sofa, forming a sharp contrast. It was beautiful and tempting, but at this moment he wanted to kill her. His thin lips pressed against her ear, and he bit her hard. The force was so strong that she almost screamed, "Lan Yu! Stop it, Lan Yu!" She called his name repeatedly, not knowing that it would arouse the man's animal nature. Chapter 3049. In the end, he leaned on her and whispered, "Chun Chun, let's start over, okay?" His voice was almost choked. "If you forget him, I can pretend that nothing happened." This was the humblest gesture a man could make. Chun Chun closed her eyes slightly. "Really? You really don't care?" When she opened her eyes again, she looked at him. "Lan Yu, you just feel guilty. You heard what Huang Xia said, didn't you? So you feel that you need to make it up to me, but I don't need it. I'm fine now. I really don't need to live with a man I don't love." She got up and looked at him. "If you want to see Rong Yu, you can still see him. I can even change his name to Lan Yu if you want. But I won't force myself to be with you for him or the past." Then, she returned to her indifferent attitude. "You know you can't force me." Lan Yu stared at her and leaned back. "Have you made up your mind?" She didn't say anything, but just smiled. Lan Yu got up gently and patted his clothes. "Chun Chun, if you don't want to, then I'll have to rob you." Then he walked out. After a few days, Chun Chun understood what he meant. She had experienced for herself how powerful the Great Yu group was now. It had only been a few days, but Qin and Mo had already reminded her a few times to not ruin her relationship with Lan Yu, both in the open and in the shadows. As Qin Chun brewed the coffee, he quietly said, "Didn't you ask me to heat up Jingyu a little? But I didn't ask you to heat him up. Look at his current titles. Male Mistress, Gigolo, Little Wolf Dog." Qin and Mo frowned. "Chun Chun, if you let Lan Yu suppress you like this, the company's investment in paging you will be in vain. Then burn him up. It's not like you can't afford it anyway." Qin Chun said indifferently. Qin Mo sighed. "But he's the male lead of He Huan's next movie." Qin Chun snorted. "I knew it. That's the main point. But brother, what happened to you and He Huan? You've been married for so many years. She's always out, and you've only seen her a few times. Did you guys divorce?" "Nonsense." Qin Mo didn't want to talk more, so he hung up. Not only him, but Pei Jingyu also came over and squeezed into Qin Chen's apartment. Qin Chen took him in, but when Pei Jingyu went in and out of her apartment, he was photographed by reporters. At that time, he was wearing a bathrobe and slippers on his feet when he threw the garbage downstairs. Qin Chen and him were on the hot search list, causing a sensation in the entertainment industry and Weibo for a few days. Qin Chen. "It's useless if I say it. It's useless if Lan Yu doesn't admit it." Qin Chen smiled. "Does it matter if I say it? If Lan Yu doesn't admit it, then it's useless." "It's useless if I say it. It's useless if Lan Yu doesn't admit it." Qin Mo was silent for a moment. "Then why don't you comfort Lan Yu and ask him to clarify it? Do you think he's willing to be cuckolded?" Qin Chen sneered. Pei Jingyu was staying with her temporarily, but they really didn't have anything. Of course, he seduced her a few times on purpose. Qin Chen only found it funny. Qin Mo thought for a moment and decided, "I'll buy the unit downstairs and tell the public that you're staying upstairs." Chapter 3050. It was a photo of her and Pei Jingyu together. She was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, with Pei Jingyu hugging her from behind. He had been joking, and she had not taken it seriously. She had pushed it away, and there was nothing. But from the looks of the photo, it was really well taken. It was a complete adultery between a man and a woman. Qin Chen looked at the back. There was a phone number written on it. She immediately recognized it as Lan Yu's. Damn it! She reached out and dialed Lan Yu's number. "What do you want?" On the other side, Lan Yu stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, his gaze lowered. "Mrs. Lan, I also want to ask you, what do you want? You took the photo?" Qin Chen's voice was a little hoarse. "Did you think about Rong Yu when you sent it out? Did you think about him when you were living with a wild man?" Lan Yu said coldly, "I'm giving you two choices now. One is to move back immediately, and I can help you clarify your scandal. 2, I will release the photo and take back Rong Yu's custody." Qin Chen gritted his teeth. "You're despicable." Lan Yu's voice became colder. "Talk about despicable? Qin Chen, you can ask your little wolf dog. He is not as harmless as you think. The private detective had investigated and found that Qin Shun and Pei Jingyu were really just sensationalizing things. But what was interesting was that Pei Jingyu was not simple. He liked Qin Shun, but Qin Shun did not know. This was a premeditated scandal. Qin Shun gritted his teeth. "What do you want? Move back tonight. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that this photo will not be spread out immediately." Lan Yu's voice was low. Qin Shun hung up the phone. She did not believe that he would dare to do that. But at night, the photos of her and Pei Jingyu were still everywhere. Pei Jingyu was frozen, and Qin Shun could not even step out of the house. Even a company like King Entertainment couldn't handle such big news in the entertainment industry. The next day, Qin Shun found a way to leave the apartment and drove to Lan Yu's office. Along the way, the employees of Grand Yu Group looked at her with awe. After all, not every woman had the courage to make CEO Lan a cuckold. Qin Shun opened the door to Lan Yu's office. Bang! Not only was Lan Yu present, but there were also a few higher-ups. However, everyone was quite tactful. When they saw Qin Shun, they automatically retreated. CEO Lan had to deal with family matters. After the door was closed, Lan Yu quietly walked to the water dispenser and poured a glass of water for her. He asked slowly, "Have you thought about it? Are you crazy?" Qin Shun stood there and looked at him coldly. "Really?" Lan Yu's eyes were cold. "Qin Shun, where did you get the confidence to think that I would tolerate my wife living with another man? Are you satisfied now? Green hats are flying everywhere, and you can't even pick one up." Qin Shun gritted his teeth. Lan Yu put the water on the coffee table in front of her and sat down. Qin Shun hesitated for a long time before she finally sat down. "Move back here. I will help you with PR and promise that I will never see him again." Lan Yu squinted his eyes and said, "I think you want Rong Yu to grow up in a normal environment. By the way, I forgot to tell you that I just picked him up from school. If you insist on living with that pretty boy, then my son will go abroad so that he won't be bothered by the rumors." Lan Yu. Qin Shun's expression changed. She did not expect him to go this far. She thought that he would have some scruples. Chapter 3051. Qin Shun glared at him. Lan Yu was still smiling. He leaned over to look at her, his slender fingers gently caressing her cheeks. His voice was a little low. "I knew you would agree." "Or what?" Qin Shun stared into his eyes. Lan Yu smiled faintly. "Or you will never see Rong Yu, know. I should call him Lan Yu." Out of consideration for the child, he decided to call him Rong Yu for the time being. "Also, your little wolf dog will be burned on the inside and burned on the outside. He will never be able to work in the entertainment industry, nor will he be by your side all day long." Lan Yu's voice was cold. Qin Shun looked at him. "Is this how you repay me for my sacrifice?" She didn't ask for anything in return, but she was annoyed by him. She pursed her lips and stared into his eyes. "Lan Yu, I am not the Qin Shun I used to be." She saw how she looked when she loved him. Her eyes were full of love when she sat on the piano and looked at the painting. But now she didn't. She only hated him. Maybe she had been a little moved, but now it was all gone. Lan Yu looked at her and knew that she had softened. He said in a low voice, "Let's start over, Qin Shun. But I gave you a chance." She smiled bitterly, but didn't say anything else. She turned around and walked out of the office. Lan Yu caught her. Qin Shun paused but didn't look back. She just whispered, "As you wish." She didn't care about Pei Jingyu's future, but she could not see Rong Yu. Lan Yu gently held her in his arms. Her body was a little stiff. He lowered his head to kiss her, and she moved to the side. But Lan Yu didn't let go of her. Instead, he turned her face and kissed her firmly. Wherever she went, he would chase after her. Finally, she ran out of energy and was forced to raise her head to let him kiss her. Lan Yu got a little excited from the kiss and carried her to the lounge. To his surprise, Qin Shun didn't resist or struggle and let him hug him. But when he wanted her, she didn't give him a response. She just bit her fist and didn't make a sound. Lan Yu couldn't do anything to her, but he couldn't help it either. After being alone for so long, it was only natural that it was intense again and again. Outside, Kevin and Rand looked at each other. The boss's spring had come again. It was just that he did not know how long this spring would last. Lan Yu did it until it was dark. When he let go of her, Chen was still lying quietly. He couldn't help but whisper in her ear, "Are you uncomfortable?" Chen didn't say anything. She was a little tired, so she turned sideways and closed her eyes. Lanyu didn't know what to do with her, so he propped himself up and exhaled happily. His fully healed body seemed to be in much better spirits, sweeping away the gloominess from before. But he was still empty, for she did not seem satisfied. Lanyu hesitated for a moment and whispered in her ear, "Can I do it a little longer?" If she still wanted, he could do it twice more. But Chen didn't say anything. She fell asleep. Lanyu looked at her quietly for a long time and slowly let go of her. He had a particularly helpless feeling, as if this marriage was even worse than the last time. He and Chen were getting worse and worse. He clearly wanted to love her, but he made her angry and disappointed again and again. He knew that she would hate him and blame him, but he couldn't care less. His desire to keep her was so strong. As long as he kept her, she would fall in love with him again. He hoped that she could remember everything, but he was afraid that she would remember. Chapter 3052. When Chen woke up, she had already returned to the villa. She opened her eyes and looked at everything around her, blinking her eyes. Lanyu walked over from the window and said, "What do you want to eat?" Only then did Chen realize that she seemed to have slept for the whole afternoon. She sat up and looked at the night sky outside. She asked him, "Where's Rongyu?" Lanyu said quietly, "We'll bring him back after the wedding." His fingers gently stroked her delicate face. "Then you'll become Mrs. Lan, the unique Mrs. Lan." He wanted to pamper her in the palm of his hand, but the premise was that she stayed by his side. Chen stared at him for a long time before she smiled. The unique? He was a little annoyed because there was some sarcasm in her tone. Chen didn't say anything else. She just lowered her head and said, "When is the wedding?" "Next week." Lanyu held her chin. "You don't have to do anything. Kevin has already done everything. You just need to try on the wedding dress." "No need. I'll tell you the size. Just pick one." Chen didn't seem very enthusiastic. Lanyu frowned. "Chen? I was married once to Rong Lei." Chen looked down and smiled. "It's better to keep a low profile." These two words provoked him. However, Lanyu couldn't get angry, nor could he blame her because she had done it for him. Although she had forgotten how much she had loved him before. Yes, he was sure that she had loved him before. Rongyu's existence proved everything. But she didn't love him anymore. Her eyes were a little empty when she looked at him. Lanyu felt a little empty, but he just lowered his head and kissed her forehead without saying anything. It wasn't important. It wasn't important. What was important was that she came back to him. Lanyu carried her to take a shower, changed into a bathrobe, and carried her downstairs to the sofa in the living room. He looked into her eyes and murmured, "I'm going to cook." Just as she was about to leave, he suddenly hugged her tightly. She pressed her face against his neck and said hoarsely, Chen, I'm sorry for what happened last time. I was just afraid that you would leave." He closed his eyes. "Yes, I was afraid that you would leave again. I can't live without you anymore." He seemed to be in the mood to express his feelings to her. Chen sat quietly. Her reason told her that if she went against him at this moment, it would absolutely not be good. Chen, I'll love you." His lips trembled as he pressed them against her soft skin. "Will you love me?" With that, he hugged her tightly. Very hard, very hard. There is a sense of hopeless helplessness. She forgot everything. She hated him. Chen looked down at his dark hair. She could feel his sadness. She slowly reached out and gently touched his hair. Finally, she pressed her face against his head. She murmured, "Lanyu, it's impossible for a person to only love one person in life. Sometimes when you miss something, you miss it. You can never find that feeling again. I also had feelings for you before, so I was willing to come back from abroad. I admit that everything I did was on a whim, but at that moment, I really had the impulse and intention to give up everything for you. I went to France just to complete the formalities." But he raped her, and then he found a small celebrity to anger her. She didn't care that much about the small celebrity, but she couldn't accept his way. Chapter 3053. However, He couldn't bring himself to be happy at all because she was making do with it. She was willing to do it for Rongyu. He knew it very well. However, he was so greedy for her warmth that he hugged her. It was a long-lost feeling. This moment was more exciting than making love with her for the whole afternoon. Lanyu hugged her for a long time before letting her go and cooking. Qinshan asked, "Do you have a piano here?" He looked back at her, then took out his phone from his pocket and made a call. In less than half an hour, a piano was moved from the piano shop. It took some time to adjust it, and it was soon ready to play. Qinshan sat there and played the piano quietly. Lanyu finished cooking and put it on the table. He stood far away from her and quietly watched her play the piano. He had a feeling that she was protecting him and putting him in a circle. It was a circle that he couldn't get involved in. He looked at her helplessly, but he didn't want to give up. After a long time, he walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. He whispered, "Play after eating." The piano stopped, and her body was a little stiff. Qinshan raised his head slightly and said quietly, "Okay." When she turned her head, Lanyu felt a little heartache. She was neither angry nor happy. He couldn't see her emotions, and she didn't mess with him. However, this made him feel even more empty. The meal was tasteless, so he cleaned up the dishes and found a place to smoke. Qinshan was still immersed in his own world, and then he realized that she did it on purpose. She used this way to express her dissatisfaction and stop him from approaching. He hugged her from behind and whispered, "You will still be free after marriage. If you want to be a model, you can still go and fly around the world." He was giving in and pleasing her. Qinshan knew. She was quiet for a while, and then she smiled softly. "Okay." Then she began to play the piano again. She played the song to Alice, which made Qinshan very angry, but he had no way to vent it. He grabbed her hand, and his expression was not very good. "Are you missing Ronglei? It's just a song. You're thinking too much." Qinshan finally stopped playing. She clenched her fingers and softly said, "I want to sleep." It was close to dawn. Lanyu frowned, but still went upstairs with her. She didn't ask him to sleep with her. He wouldn't agree anyway. After returning to his room, Qinshan washed his face and sat in front of the dresser to apply some skincare products. In the mirror, she could see that Lanyu was not asleep. He was only leaning against the headboard in his bathrobe, with a magazine in his hand. He was waiting for her. She couldn't help but wonder, was he still not satisfied after one afternoon? He was already in his 30s, yet he was still so energetic. It was not a good thing for his wife. She applied it slowly and delicately, but he was more patient than she was. He kept looking at the magazine as if it was very interesting. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She walked over, lifted the quilt, and laid down beside him. She whispered, "I don't want it tonight." But as soon as she went up and finished speaking, her body was pressed down. His handsome face was close to her face. "But I want it." She struggled. He didn't let her go, even though she was panting. Instead, he grabbed her hand and pressed it on the pillow. When she moved, it was as if she was sending herself to his mouth. Qinshan was extremely angry and even more unwilling. She struggled like this, and suddenly there was a little red on the pillow. Lanyu was stunned for a moment, and then he let go of her hand. Her hand was bleeding after playing the piano all night. It wasn't a serious injury, but her hand was full of wounds. At that moment, Lanyu felt that those wounds were on his heart. Chapter 3054. He was stunned for a moment. Then he pulled her up, carefully looked at the wound on her hand, and said very softly, "I'll go get the medicine." At this moment, all his anger was gone, and only one thought was that she was injured. Lanyu went to get the medicine, and when he returned to the bedroom, Qinshan was leaning against the headboard, quietly thinking about something. He stood by the door, and his heart felt like it had been hit hard. He slowly walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at her. "Give me your hand." Qinshan, on the other hand, obediently gave him his hand. Lanyu's movements were considered gentle, and he gently bandaged both of her hands. He looked at her face silently and said softly, "You're already so old, yet you still hurt yourself. The guqin is there. You can play it whenever you want," he said as he reached out to touch her hair. Qinshan bit her lip, didn't say anything, and lay down quietly. Lanyu quietly looked at her for a while, then put away the medicine box. When he came back, he lay beside her and didn't touch her again, just hugged her, careful not to hurt her hand. He hugged her quietly like this. He buried his face in her hair and said in a low voice, "I'll help you take a bath tomorrow, Chun Chun." Chin Chun. That night passed peacefully because of her hand injury. The next morning, Lanyu got up and made breakfast for her, and asked her to get up and have breakfast with him. In fact, he didn't have to ask her to get up since she had to go back to sleep in a while, but he wanted to have the ritual of family life. Chin Chun didn't resist and did whatever he said. Her indifferent look made him a little dissatisfied, but he didn't know why he was angry. Lanyu finished breakfast, changed the medicine on Chin Chun's hand, and checked it. It should be fine tomorrow. She didn't say anything and went upstairs to catch up on sleep. She settled down with a clear conscience, living like a rice worm. Lanyu looked at her with a somewhat deep gaze. After a long time, he got up and walked to the parking lot outside. After getting in the car, he put his hands on the steering wheel, quietly alone for a while, and then drove. When he left the villa, his heart was a little full, because Chin Chun returned here. He went to the company and called back, but Chin Chun was probably sleeping, so he didn't answer. At noon, he directly called home and asked the servant to pick up. The servant picked up, and Lanyu coughed lightly. "Is Madam awake?" The servant immediately said, "Not yet. I went to order lunch, but she said she didn't want to eat." "I got it." Lanyu hung up. Then he looked at the phone in his hand, lost. After that, he looked at the phone in his hand for a while. This time, Chin Chun picked up. He should have woken up. "Why aren't you getting up to eat? Are you acting like a child who needs someone to take care of you?" When Lanyu said this, he didn't even know how gentle he was. On the other side, Chin Chun was a little stiff. "I don't want to eat it." "You don't want to eat? Or are you angry?" He paused. Chin Chun was silent for a while, and then said in a low voice, "My hand hurts, so I don't want to eat." Lanyu chuckled. "Then I'll come back to feed you, okay?" She thought he was joking, but about half an hour later, Lanyu really came back. The servants at home were a little surprised, so usually wouldn't come back at this time. But no matter how surprised they were, they still went to greet him. Lanyu took off his coat and threw it on the sofa. He unbuttoned his cuffs and said, "Is Madam still upstairs?" Chapter 3055. Lanyu paused for a moment and said, "Make 2 delicious dishes. I'll bring them up later." The servant went down with a smile, unable to contain her joy. Mr. Chin looked very happy, like a young man in his 20s. Logically speaking, Mr. Chin wouldn't spoil a woman so much at his age. Besides, Mr. Chin's business was very big, and he didn't have time to coax his wife like a little girl. But Mr. Chin came back. How loving! The servant immediately cooked some side dishes and brought them over, along with 2 bowls of rice. Lanyu carried them upstairs slowly. He went upstairs and put the food in the living room. Then he was stunned, because the woman who said that her hand hurt was playing games on her phone. Lanyu didn't know that Chin Chun was playing games. Probably because she was born to be a doctor, her movements were very sensitive, but he saw his heart twitch. Some kind of throbbing in his body turned into a deeper impulse. But he didn't take action. He just took the phone from her hand and swiped it a few times. "Didn't you say your hand hurt?" Chin Chun looked up at him. "Why are you back?" After saying that, she took back his phone. "I'm not done playing games yet. Time to eat." Lanyu directly confiscated her phone and put it in his pocket. He walked towards the living room and said lightly, "If my hand is healed, does it mean that I can?" Chin Chun immediately got up. "I'm eating." Lanyu, who was walking in front, smiled slightly and sat down on the sofa in the living room. He sat down with his hand on his thigh and looked up at her. Chin Chun sat opposite him and looked at the dishes in front of him in a daze. "You don't like it?" Lanyu ate elegantly. Chin Chun smiled and deliberately disagreed with him. "Well, I don't want to eat it. I want to eat what you cook." She did it on purpose, deliberately making things difficult for him. She wanted him to make her unbearable. It would be best if they didn't get married. There was no need to hold a wedding and immediately kick her out. Lanyu ate halfway, wiped his lips, and said indifferently, "I'll go cook for you." But when he got up, he pulled her up with him. Chin Chun was naturally unwilling. He looked at her and said, "You can still play games in the small restaurant." He could cook, but he wanted her by his side. Qin Shun pursed his lips and didn't say anything in the end. He just took out his phone from his pocket. When he picked up his phone, he accidentally touched something he shouldn't have. Lan Yu tilted his head and looked at her meaningfully. "You want it?" "No." She raised her phone. "I accidentally touched it." He smiled and held her hand as they went downstairs. He ordered the servants to clean up the leftovers. Qinshin was playing games at the dining table while Lan Yu was cooking. As he chopped vegetables and listened to the sound of her playing the game, he felt a little happy. Blissfully, he finally had the life he had yearned for a long time. He didn't care whether she and Rong Lei were real husband and wife or not. Rong Lei was dead, and she forgot everything. He didn't want to remind her of the painful memories, so he didn't care. As Lan Yu thought about it, he accidentally cut his hand. The wound wasn't big, but there was some blood. He wiped it with a tissue and didn't say anything. He quietly continued to cut vegetables. Qinshin looked up at him. She saw him bleeding. Chapter 3056. Qinshin didn't understand why he was so stubborn. Why did he have to pick up a lost love? Her eyes were a little confused. When Lan Yu brought the food over, he saw her in a daze. He smiled faintly. "What's wrong?" Qinshin shook her head and lowered her head to eat quietly. Lan Yu didn't eat. He just sat opposite her and quietly smoked a cigarette. When he raised his hand, the wound on his palm was clearly visible, but she didn't ask. He thought that she didn't love him anymore and still hated him, so he didn't care that he hurt her. And he actually hoped that she would care about him, even if it was just one sentence. He was so good to her, spoiling her and spoiling her. His heart was full and empty. He didn't know what was wrong with him. What did he want? He clearly got it, but he was so unsatisfied. If he wasn't satisfied, he would find it at night. That night, no matter what she was thinking, he pressed on her again and again, as intense as if it was the first time he touched her. Qinshin bit her lip and turned her face to the side. She had been holding it in. Only when he was really heavy would she let out a soft moan. Just like that, they continued like this until it was late at night, when he finally let go of her. It was like that between a husband and wife, but the silence after it was so empty. Qinshin. He hugged her and buried his face in her hair. His voice was a little low. "What do I have to do to get you back? Tell me." She lay quietly and reached out to hug him. She spoke, her voice a little hoarse and a little light. "Did I make you uncomfortable, Lan Yu? Why do you keep me by your side if you're uncomfortable?" He was stunned for a long time. After a long silence, he said in a low voice, "I just want you to treat me better, even just a little bit." Qinshin hugged his shoulder, her face on his shoulder. "I'm sorry. There were some things she couldn't help him with." Lan Yu hugged her quietly for a long time before letting her go. His sadness seemed to have been swept away, and he was once again full of vigor. "I'm going to wash you up," he murmured and carried her to the bathroom. There he loved her again, tenderly this time. If he wanted something, Qinshin would give it to him. She had never refused. In the end, he leaned on her shoulder and panted. "You didn't reject him because you wanted to see Rong Yu?" Qinshin didn't say anything, which was a tacit agreement. Lan Yu calmed down for a while, stood under the shower, and finally took a towel to wipe his body. As he wiped, he said, "He's with my dad. He did not send Rong Yu abroad." Qinshin frowned. "Not happy?" He pinched her face. "I thought you'd be happy." With that said, he pulled her over and kissed her for a long time before speaking in a hoarse voice. "I'll bring him back tomorrow. But you know what I'll do if you leave." "Lan Yu, you don't have to remind yourself how much of a jerk you are." Qinshin snorted coldly. Lan Yu smiled faintly, carried her back to the master bedroom, and kissed her face. "Do you feel bullied?" She was too lazy to care about him. Lan Yu smiled, pulled the quilt over to wrap her up, and kissed her. "Actually, Rong Yu is doing well with my father. Why don't we let him take care of him for 2 years? He wanted to spend time alone with her. 2 years should be enough to make her fall in love with him again." Chapter 3057. The next day, Qinshin brought Qinshin to his father's house to pick up Xiao Rongyu. This was Qinshin's request. Lan Yu's car drove into his father's villa, and Xiao Rongyu ran out. "Uncle Lan, Xiao Rongyu was very close to Lan Yu, probably because they were related by blood. Lan Yu picked him up and kissed him. "Are you a good boy?" Xiao Rongyu nodded. "Yes." Lan Yu smiled. He knew that he didn't want to go to school. Xiao Rongyu grew up abroad, so he hadn't adapted to this place yet. It was difficult for him to get along with his classmates. Xiao Rongyu didn't like to go to school, but he still liked to play. At this time, Xiao Rongyu hugged Lan Yu's neck. He saw Qin Shun and hugged him. "Mom." No matter how good Grandpa Lan was, he still missed his mom. Qin Shun hugged him and buried his face in the little boy's hair. It was small and soft. She had once said that she could give Rongyu to Lan Yu, but she couldn't bear to do it. She hugged the little boy and took a deep breath. Xiao Rongyu looked at his mom and asked seriously, "Mom, are you really going to get married to Uncle Lan?" He gestured and said, "The kind who wears a wedding dress." Qin Shun smiled faintly, and yes. Xiao Rongyu looked at Lan Yu and then at his mom. He blushed and asked, "Does Mom love Uncle Lan?" Qin Shun gave a vague yes. What did he mean? Xiao Rongyu didn't understand and looked at her. Lan Yu walked over and asked, "What are you talking about?" Qin Shun shook his head. "No, nothing." Xiao Rongyu gave his mom a mocking look and said, "I asked Mom if she loves Uncle Lan." Lan Yu looked at him and smiled. "What did Mom say?" After asking, he looked at Qin Shun with clear eyes. Qin Shun ignored him and threw Rongyu to him. "I don't want my son anymore." Xiao Rongyu looked at Lan Yu with a pitiful expression. Lan Yu smiled. "Your mother is just shy." "Really?" Little Rongyu was doubtful. Lan Yu reached out and stroked his soft hair. "Adults are very complicated. Your mother used to love me so much that she couldn't help herself. She was willing to give up everything for me." Rongyu's eyes sparkled. "What about now?" Lan Yu paused for a moment, and then responded with a as well. Xiao Rongyu urged him, "Do you love her now?" "This you have to ask your mother." Lan Yu's voice is quite light. Xiao Rongyu pursed his lips. She only knows how to say "man." The more Xiao Rong thought about it, the more he thought about it. He definitely didn't love her anymore. If he did, it wouldn't be like this. Although he didn't really like his mother marrying someone else, he still hoped that his mother would marry love. Well, it was just like what was shown on TV. Qin Shun looked at them and could roughly guess what they were talking about, but she didn't say anything. Papa Lan was quite happy. This time, they were really going to get married. Although they had gotten a marriage certificate before, it was a secret marriage. It meant that they would divorce if they didn't like it. Now, it was good that it was public. If it was public, it wouldn't be easy to get a divorce. He knew his son very well. Papa Lan cooked a meal and sent them home early after eating. He also asked them to bring Xiao Rongyu back. Chapter 3058. Lan Yu told him that Xiao Rong was his flesh and blood, which was really great. Finally, the Lan family had a descendant. When the car left, Father Lan watched it go away with a loving look on his face. He thought about the conversation with his son. He asked Lan Yu if he wanted to change the name of the child. Lan Yu hesitated for a moment and said that it was okay. To be honest, he was quite disappointed. This was the child of the Lan family. Father Lan stared at the car until it was out of sight. In the car, Lan Yu focused on the road ahead and asked Xiao Rongyu, "Where do you want to go?" Xiao Rongyu thought about it and said, "I want to go home." Lan Yu smiled and turned the car into the highway. In less than half an hour, the car drove into the villa, but Xiao Rongyu fell asleep. When Lan Yu opened the car door, his face was very gentle, and his voice was also soft. "Let me carry him." He gently picked up the child and carried him to the children's room upstairs. Only then did Qin Shun realize that the room had been rearranged. She thought bitterly, the treatment of a biological child and a child is different. Lan Yu didn't leave immediately after putting down Xiao Rongyu. Instead, he sat quietly and looked at him for a while. Qin Shun went back to his room first. She couldn't look at his infatuated eyes. Lan Yu looked for a while, got up, and walked back to his bedroom. Qin Shun was already lying down for an afternoon nap. There were faint green shadows under her eyes, which meant that she hadn't slept well these days. Lan Yu knew that it was because of his excessive needs. His face was a little hot, and he lay down beside her to catch up on his sleep. When Qin Shun woke up, Lan Yu was gone. She put her face on the pillow and closed her eyes slightly while smelling the good smell. Rong-yu's happy voice came from downstairs. She lay down for a while, put on a morning robe, and looked down from the second floor. Lan-yu and Xiao Rong-yu were sitting on the sofa on the first floor, playing checkers. They were having a good time. She hadn't seen Rong-yu so happy for a long time. Even a child with such a high IQ used to think that this game was too retarded, but now he was so happy. And Lan-yu, was he that free? How could he be this serious when playing with a child? Qinshan felt a little disgusted when he looked at it. However, he looked at it for a long time. Silently, she returned to her room. Downstairs, Xiao Rong-yu quietly said, "Uncle Lan, Mama was peeping just now." Lan-yu replied indifferently, "He's peeking at me. Not you." "Why?" Xiao Rong-yu was not convinced. Lan-yu looked upstairs and said slowly, "You came out of her belly. Not holding your hand is like holding her own hand. How can I feel anything?" Xiao Rong-yu's face was full of suspicion. "You make it sound like Mom has feelings for you." His father's face darkened. "Why is it gone?" Xiao Rong-yu faintly sighed. "If I have feelings, Uncle Lan, you don't have to force it." Lan-yu. There was no way to communicate with this son of his. After he finished playing checkers, he said, "I'm going upstairs. If I can't win, I'll be shameless." Xiao Rong-yu secretly made a face at his back. Lan-yu turned around and said, "Don't secretly change places in the future if I don't see you." This time, it was Xiao Rong-yu, who felt that there was no way to communicate happily. Lan-yu stood in the middle of the stairs and frowned. "I heard that you want to be a lawyer in the future. A lawyer must have the spirit of seeking truth from facts." Xiao Rong-yu smiled and said, "In the future, I plan to serve a profiteer like Uncle Lan." Lan-yu, MP. Chapter 3059. Lan-yu stared at Xiao Rong-yu for a while, then turned around and went upstairs. The door of the master bedroom was closed. He pushed the door open and saw Qinshan leaning against the bed, reading a magazine. Hearing the sound of the door closing, she tilted her head and said, "Are you done with the game?" Lan-yu walked to the bed and sat down. He took the magazine from her hand and said, "Let's go to take wedding photos later." "There's no need for that." Qinshan looked disinterested. Lan-yu frowned and said, "We have to hold a wedding. Aren't you going to wear a wedding dress?" "It's up to you. Just make it according to my size. Don't take photos." "I don't like to take photos," Qinshan said calmly. Lan-yu frowned and said, "Qinshan, you're deliberately going against me, aren't you?" "I don't dare. Otherwise, Mr. Lan will make it impossible for me to see my son again," Qinshan said sarcastically. The veins on Lan-yu's forehead were bulging, but he couldn't do anything to her. He pursed his lips and held her chin. "Then I'll threaten you now. If you don't take photos, I'll..." Childish. Qinshan sat up and walked into the fitting room without saying anything. Lan-yu followed her and leaned against the door. She didn't avoid him and changed her clothes directly in front of him. To be honest, her figure was perfect a few years ago, but it seemed to have become more attractive after giving birth. Lan-yu looked at his wife's perfect figure and said, "Actually, you want to go, but you don't mean it. It's just like in bed. You obviously like it, but you say no. You say that I forced you." Qinshan glanced at him and said, "Lan-yu, you can always be shameless in such a unique way." Lan-yu only smiled faintly and did not say anything. Qinshan changed her clothes and followed him downstairs to get in the car. To her surprise, the wedding photos he mentioned were taken outdoors. It wasn't a grand wedding dress, but a simple dress. On the other hand, he was wearing his regular clothes, a classic black and white suit. He brought her to a beautiful street, and the photographer behind him was in charge of taking pictures. Qinshan looked at his hand, being held, and frowned. "Lan-yu, are you in love?" Lan-yu stood in front of the cotton candy machine. "Bought two, one for her. Mrs. Lan, we are going to get married soon. You can rest assured that I will be loyal to marriage. People with criminal records can't be trusted, but I don't care." She nibbled on the pink cotton candy and looked at him. He looked at her intently. This scene was captured by the cameraman. Lan-yu brought her to many other places and took pictures of her at every place. When the night fell and the photos were taken, Qinshan was exhausted. Lan-yu took her to the studio. She collapsed on the sofa, still wearing the little dress. Lanyu was communicating with the photographer. In the end, he chose about 20 photos and bound them into a book. The cotton candy one would be used as the wedding photo, and he would also make a crystal one to hang on the bed. Originally, these were things that women liked to do, but now Lanyu was doing them. He was also happy to do it. He was thinking that if it was the previous Qin-shun, the Qin-shun in men's clothes, he would probably still be the one to do their wedding, and others would even guess which one of them was the main one. This was actually not bad. After choosing the photos, he looked at her and smiled. It's done. Chapter 3060. He was very gentle and accommodating to her. It wasn't that Qin-shun didn't feel it, but she couldn't respond to him. She got up and left with him. Instead of driving back immediately, he took her to a restaurant. It was a seafood restaurant. Standing at the door, Lanyu said quietly, "You used to like it very much. Later, I learned to make you supper, paella, but you might not like it anymore." Last time, she said she didn't like it, so he didn't make it again. But they were going to get married, so he couldn't help but bring her here to see the place they used to walk together. Maybe she wouldn't remember the past for the rest of her life. Or maybe she wouldn't be able to love him again for the rest of her life. But this time, he would love her well. Qin-shun looked at him quietly. "Come in and have a seat." She could feel his emotions, so she didn't object. She sat in the restaurant with him. The restaurant wasn't big, nor was it particularly elegant, but there were many customers. The waiter quickly brought the menu over. He seemed to know Lanyu and said naturally, "Mr. Lan is here again." As he said that, he looked at Qin-shun. "Is this Mrs. Lan? Is she also your girlfriend who always packed?" Lanyu looked at the menu and nodded slightly. Qin-shun was a little surprised. After he ordered, he asked him, "Did you come here often in the past? I mean, when I wasn't here, when I was in France?" Lanyu lit a cigarette and said faintly, "When I hate you very much, I'll come over for a meal and pack a meal." Qin-shun held his chin. "Who ate the food you packed?" "The dog fed it," Lanyu said honestly. Qin-shun glared at him. "Lanyu, you bastard." He chuckled softly. "There's something even more bastardly. Do you want to hear it?" Of course, she chose not to listen. At this time, the waiter brought over a seafood platter. It was all freshly grilled seafood, and each one was very beautiful. Qin-shun was a little embarrassed. "I thought there was nothing else here except for seafood and curry rice." Lanyu smiled faintly and put out the cigarette. He picked up an especially large Australian lobster and peeled it. He peeled a large piece of meat and placed it in the bowl in front of her. "For me?" Qin-shun was a little surprised. Lanyu raised an eyebrow. "What else? I thought you were going to feed the dogs." Qin-shun deliberately picked on him. Lanyu smiled. "Puppy, come and eat." As he spoke, he peeled another one and stuffed it directly into her mouth. The prawn meat was too big, so it was stuffed to the brim. She didn't even have the chance to speak or protest. She could only eat it. After he finished eating, he glanced at him. "Childish." The childish man continued to feed, smiling faintly. For a moment, Qin-shun felt his love for her. At least at this moment, he should love her. Or he really loved her in the past. She asked softly, "Lanyu, do you want me to get my memory back?" He was still busy peeling the prawns. When he heard that, he just shook his head. "It's good that you don't remember." Qin-shun didn't ask anymore. She ate the seafood he served and looked at his greasy hands from time to time. Her hands were clean. After a while, Lanyu asked for beer. Qin-shun looked at him. "I don't drink." "It's me." He smiled and gave her the car key. "You drive later." Qin-shun glared at him. Lanyu smiled. "I want to drink some." Chapter 3061. The waiter brought the beer over and glanced at Lanyu when he put it down. "Thank you." Lanyu smiled faintly. The waiter's face turned red. Qin-shun looked at him. After the waiter left, she snorted and said, "The market seems to be good." Lanyu took off his jacket and very slowly placed it on the back of the chair. He very slowly rolled up his sleeves and very slowly said, "I have very high standards." He began to drink, eating seafood while drinking and occasionally peeling some for her. Qin-shun was indifferent. He was full after eating for a while. Lanyu, on the other hand, ate for a long time. He seemed to be in a good mood and drank a lot of beer. Later, he asked the waiter for 2 more bottles. Qin-shun couldn't help saying, Lan Yu, if I drink to death, won't you become the richest widow? He looked at her and smiled calmly. Don't worry, I signed an agreement. If I'm gone one day, everything I have will be yours. He added, Rong Yu is still young, so I'll give you Qin Shen. Qin Shen's voice was a little dry. Lan Yu, that's not what I meant. But that's what I meant, Qin Shen. Lan Yu said seriously. No one can predict tomorrow. What he didn't say was that he wanted to hold today. She and Rong Yu today. Qin Shen pursed his lips and didn't know what to say. Lan Yu smiled. I'm just saying if Qin Shen, I'm not someone who will die after drinking a few bottles of beer. Qin Shen glared at him. He smiled and poured himself another bottle of beer. Qin Shen suddenly raised his voice. Waiter, 5 more bottles. Lan Yu raised his eyebrows. I want you to drink to death. Qin Shen smiled softly and said slowly. Lan Yu's eyes were a little clear. You want me to die so much? At this moment, the waiter came over and brought 5 more bottles of beer. Lan Yu placed 2 bottles in front of Qin Shen. Let's drink together. Don't you expect me to drive? Qin Shen's voice was indifferent. Lan Yu smiled. I'll find a designated driver later. Qin Shen didn't refuse anymore and directly took the bottle to drink. Lan Yu watched quietly and reached out to pick a crab for her. Have some more. She raised her eyes and stared at him silently. A moment later, she pursed her lips and ate it. Lan Yu smiled. Now you're cute. Qin Shen was speechless, but she still ate it. After he finished eating, he handed her another beer. Just like that, Qin Shen got drunk, and Lan Yu didn't call for a designated driver. He carried her on his back when they went out. The night was cold, and the streets were full of neon lights. Qin Shen lay on Lan Yu's back. She opened her eyes in a daze and only saw his black head. She bit her lower lip. Where are we? On the way home, Lan Yu said softly. Qin Shen, do you still remember the way home? She loved him, but she forgot the way home. She was drunk. Perhaps her subconscious mind could remember that she had loved him. Now it was just because he was hateful and he treated her badly. Qin Shen, no matter how bad I treat you, please don't leave. I will find a way to take you home. Under the starry sky, he carried her on his back. He could have taken a car, but he insisted on carrying her home. He carried her on his back so far and carried her on his back through the streets they had been to together. The streetlights elongated their silhouettes, so long that Lan Yu felt a little sad. He stood still and looked at the night in front of them. He said to the person behind him in a low voice, Qin Shen, we're back. She was drunk and couldn't hear him at all. Perhaps he said that because she couldn't hear him. Chapter 3062. Lan Yu carried her on his back. Instead of going back to the villa, he went to her apartment. They took the elevator up to the door of her apartment. He turned sideways and said softly, Qin Shen, key? What key? She tilted her head and asked. Then, she looked at the door of the apartment and smiled. I know my home. She pinched his handsome face and asked innocently, Lan Yu, why did you come to my house? What do you want to do? She asked innocently, which was not like her, nor was it like how she used to be. However, Lan Yu's heart was very soft. Qin Shen, you've never acted like a spoiled child to me before. He smiled and put her down. Then, he took her bag and rummaged through it for the key. Qin Shen was unwilling. She snatched the bag from his hand and bit her lip. I'll get it myself. However, she couldn't find it for a long time. She had a bad temper, so she threw the bag on the ground and sulked. She had never been like this. Lan Yu had never seen her drunk, so he was surprised. However, he remembered that she used to be a doctor, so she usually didn't drink. He didn't expect her to be like this when she was drunk. He looked at her and slowly squatted down, as if to accompany her or to laugh at her. You're angry? No. Qin Shen looked at him and then bit her lip. Lan Yu, if I'm angry, will you comfort me? Her eyes were straight and particularly seductive. At least, Lan Yu was seduced. She wasn't young anymore, and she wasn't an innocent girl. She was also a mother of a child, but at this moment, her eyes were pure and seductive. Lan Yu sighed and didn't open the door. Instead, he squatted down and kissed her for a while. Their soft lips touched gently and slowly. The sound was a little warm, and there was an indescribable feeling. It was like a heartbeat, like first love. This feeling happened when Qinshin was drunk. Lanyu was not satisfied with this kind of contact and began to deepen the kiss. His face was very hot, and so was hers. Finally, he was satisfied and released her a little. She was still drunk and licked her lips. Lanyu? He smiled, took her bag, and swiped the key card. Then he pulled her up and brought her into the apartment. Now that they were husband and wife, he treated this place as if it was his own home when he came in again. He carried her to the sofa, where Pei Jingyu had been lying. His body hovered above her, and his voice was low. How long has he lived here? He was talking about Pei Jingyu. Qin Chun, who was drunk, could hear it, but she pretended not to understand. Her eyes were filled with innocence. Lanyu, what are you talking about? I don't know. He was still pressing her down. His gaze was slightly tense as he stared straight into her eyes. Pei Jingyu. He said it word by word, his slender fingers caressing her red lips. He felt that if he wanted to get the truth out of her, he could only do it tonight. Qin Chun blinked. 1 week. Then, before he asked anything else, she said honestly, I took him in because he's good-looking, can cook, and has very good muscles. Lanyu narrowed his eyes. You mean you took a man in mainly because of his masculinity? Chapter 3063. Lanyu felt that it was a little difficult to communicate with her. He coughed and said, What about me? Am I not good-looking? Qinshin bit her lip and leaned over to look at him. She really wanted to die tonight. The word naive had nothing to do with her before, but she grasped it really well at this time. Lanyu's pupils dilated slightly. Qinshin kissed his chin and said, You're good-looking too. His heart seemed to have fallen to the ground. It was really a bit embarrassing to fight for favor with a little fresh meat at his age. If Qinshin hadn't been drunk, he wouldn't have done that. Qinshin kissed his chin and then kissed his lips. Suddenly, Lanyu thought of a very serious matter. He frowned and held her chin to stop her from moving again. He asked her seriously, Have you kissed him like this before? He clearly knew that she and Pei Jingyu were just creating a relationship, but he still cared about it. Qinshin frowned and thought hard. I think so. This time, Lanyu almost exploded. You let him kiss you? I think I kissed him, she said honestly. Wasn't it normal for a woman who was almost 30 to take advantage of others? Lanyu went crazy. He pinched her chin hard and said in a very direct tone, I think you're tired of living, Mrs. Lan. It's Mrs. Rome. I'm Mrs. Rome. She began to talk nonsense. Lanyu was so angry that he turned his back. He originally thought that she was quite cute when she was drunk, but now he felt even angrier. He let go of her and sat aside. He didn't want to talk to her. He ignored her, but she came to provoke him. She leaned against him and asked softly, Do you like me very much? So you're staying at my house? Lanyu's eyebrows moved. He looked at her face, which was close to him, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Do you know who you're talking to? Lanyu, she said matter-of-factly, still looking at his face. You've been staying at my house all this time, and I can't get rid of you. She looked at herself and suddenly said, Wait a minute. Lanyu looked in her eyes and didn't say anything. She quickly ran back to the bedroom. Lanyu slowly sat down. His mind was blank. After a moment of blankness, he understood that Qin Chun had always remembered him subconsciously. She just didn't want to remember him subconsciously. He was worried that there would be a problem with her memory. She usually seemed fine, but she was a little confused after drinking. He smoked furiously, a little annoyed. Just as he was feeling vexed, Qin Chun came out. She was only wearing a black shirt, and her long hair was tied up. It was beautiful, but what shocked him the most was that this shirt was his. It was the one he had worn that night when he held her on the piano and made love to her. It was also the one in the painting. She still kept it? Perhaps she had left it by accident, but it was still here. The cigarette between Lanyu's fingers trembled, and he almost burned himself. He asked in a hoarse voice, Where did you get this? She didn't answer, but walked over wearing only this damn shirt. She knelt beside him. After a long time, she asked, Did you come here to have sex with me? This was the conversation they had in the past. Now that she said it, he actually felt sour. He suddenly pulled her into his arms, and his face pressed against hers, squeezing so hard that there wasn't a gap. Chapter 3064. His face was still very hot, and he kept pressing against her. She felt a little uncomfortable and wanted to break free, but he was holding her down so forcefully that she couldn't move at all. After a long time, he carried her off the sofa with one hand and walked towards the piano. He placed her on the cover of the piano, tidied her hair, and loosened a button. "I want to paint you." His forehead was against hers, and his voice was hoarse. Chin's slender arms hugged him. The canvas is in the storage room. Lan Yu's gaze was slightly tense, and then he went to get the tools. She thought that he would paint like this, but he unbuttoned the shirt. No. She was drunk, but not so drunk that she didn't know that she couldn't accept such a scale. Her fingers covered her collar, and she bit her lip. "I don't want to do this." But Lan Yu wanted to paint her. He wanted to paint like crazy. He hadn't painted for a very, very long time. He hadn't painted since a few years ago when he stopped painting at the auction. She was the one who seduced him tonight to paint again. This time, he wanted to paint all of her, and only the paintings from his collection. Chin wasn't willing, so he coaxed her, and even used his own body to tempt her. Finally, she agreed. She lay down on the expensive piano with her fair and clean body. The entanglement of black and white was the most sophisticated. Every inch of her was perfect, and it made people go crazy. A hint of passion flashed in Lan Yu's eyes. He began to work. Because his right hand had been injured, his painting wasn't perfect, and many lines were distorted. But he drew her charm, and he drew the innocence and shyness in her eyes. That night, he spent 3 hours painting her. When he finished, Chin lay there and fell asleep. The person in his painting was also asleep. Her face was rosy, and her body was relaxed. Even the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. Lan Yu looked at the painting, and his once-dead thoughts came back to life. When he and Chin were together, there were many times when he felt that he was forcing her, and she wasn't happy. But at this moment, he felt that she was actually satisfied and happy. Her happiness was hidden too deeply, belonging to the deepest part of her memory. Lan Yu stood in front of the piano, gently stroking her lips, and smiled. He kissed her and carried her back to the bedroom. In her bed, he was going to kill her. Inch by inch, he wanted her so clearly and deeply. When she woke up, he was kissing her and making love to her. He told her that he was Lan Yu. It was none other than Lan Yu. In her tears, he carved himself into her body and into her soul. Her tipsiness seemed to have receded a lot, and there was some rationality in her eyes. But in the dead of the night, how much sobriety could she maintain? After a night of indulgence, Lan Yu slept a little late. When he woke up, there was no one beside him. He opened his eyes and looked around. There was nothing around him. However, there was a smell of coffee in the air. It was Chin who was making coffee. Lan Yu closed his eyes. He almost thought that he had returned to the past, to the side of the person who loved to drink coffee. He lifted the quilt, got up, walked into the bathroom, and looked at himself in the mirror. His neck and chest were slender scratches. She didn't have this problem in the past. Now, no matter if he was rough or gentle, she liked to scratch him, and especially couldn't stand it. Whenever he touched her, she would get excited. Lan Yu brushed his teeth and thought happily that she was actually a lot more perverted than before, but she didn't want to admit it. It was really a little cute. Chapter 3065. He brushed his teeth and walked out. Chin was indeed making coffee. She was drinking it when he went out. Lan Yu frowned. "You're drinking coffee on an empty stomach?" Chin sipped the coffee in his cup and said lightly, "Nothing. I've been drinking it for many years." He walked over and took her cup. "Don't drink it again." Then he said with disdain, "You always drink coffee. Your teeth will turn yellow, and your kissing won't be perfect." Chin's eyes widened. She almost couldn't believe what he was saying. She had seen shameless people, but she had never seen someone as shameless as him. He seemed to have forgotten the conflict between them. Did he think that everything would go back to how it used to be if they went out for a meal? Chin smiled and sat down on the sofa, flipping through a magazine. "I'll make breakfast for you." Lan Yu put the cup back and went to the kitchen to open the fridge. He found some ingredients and made 2 bowls of mushroom chicken noodles. He was very good at cooking. The soup was very rich. Qinshan didn't refuse and quietly finished a bowl. Lan Yu finished eating, took out a cigarette, and took a puff. Qinshan looked at him and said, "Sister Quan picked up Venus for me." "Venus?" Lan Yu looked at her quietly and asked her slowly, "The kind that only wears 2 pieces of fabric and walks on the stage." Qinshan poured a glass of water for himself and said lightly, "I've been in a lingerie show before." "You were my wife before." Lan Yu's expression didn't look good. Qinshan looked at him quietly and said, "You said I could return to the modeling circle. But that doesn't mean I'm willing to let the whole world see my wife." Lan Yu was quite insistent on this matter. Qinshan didn't want to pay attention to him. In the modeling circle, lingerie shows were normal. He was simply discriminating against her. There was a moment of silence. The little warmth they had established last night suddenly disappeared. Just when the atmosphere was tense, Lan Yu's phone rang. He frowned and took a look. It was a call from one of his servants. After the call was connected, the servant's voice sounded a little panicked. "Sir, the young master fell down and bled a lot." Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and said, "Ask the driver to take him to the hospital immediately. Qinshan and I will go there right away." After that, he hurriedly gave a few instructions. Qinshan was also stunned. Then, she was a little dazed. Lan Yu had already taken the car keys and quickly grabbed her hand. When the door was closed, Qinshan was slightly awake. She looked at him and said with a trembling voice, "Lan Yu, Rongyu, he'll be fine." Lan Yu's voice was firm, but his expression was tense. After getting into the car, he fastened his seat belt and asked, "What's his blood type?" Qinshan's voice was a little airy. "Type B. Then I can give him a blood transfusion," Lan Yu said calmly and started the car. He drove very fast and arrived at the hospital in less than 20 minutes. At the same time, Rongyu was also sent by the family's driver. Lan Yu directly took him to the emergency room. He had accidentally fallen down the stairs, and there was a lot of blood on his forehead. He didn't know if there were any other injuries. After the emergency room issued the bill, Lan Yu carried Xiao Rongyu to the examination. He held him the whole time. Xiao Rongyu was also a little scared. He put his little hand around his neck and whispered, "Will I die?" Lan Yu's voice was a little hoarse. "No, I'm here." Chapter 3066. Rongyu pursed his lips and didn't say anything. He just hugged her a little tighter. Lan Yu took him to get an x-ray. There was nothing wrong with him, but he had lost too much blood and needed a blood transfusion. Lan Yu took 200 cubic centimeters of blood. When the bright red blood seeped into Rongyu's body, Rongyu lay down and asked, "Are you really my father's?" Lan Yu didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached out and touched his little face. "Are you happy?" she asked in a low voice. Rongyu's eyes were a little cautious. His eyes turned and fell on Qinshan's face. "Mommy," he called softly. Qinshan tried to smile. Her face was even paler than Rongyu's. Rongyu's expression became even more cautious. "Mommy, can I call you Daddy?" He was usually naughty, but he didn't dare to make decisions on his own. He was afraid that his mother would be angry. Qinshan looked at his eager little face and said softly, "Of course." She agreed, but Rongyu didn't say it out loud. His pale little face was dyed with a thin layer of red. It was a mess. Lan Yu didn't force him. He just touched his little face. Rongyu gently rubbed against it. Now that he had a father and a mother, he was very happy. After all, he had lost too much blood. Soon, Rongyu was a little sleepy and fell asleep. Qinshan looked at Lan Yu's slightly pale face and said softly, "Go over there and lie down. I'll watch over Rongyu." "It's okay." Lan Yu's eyes fell on Rongyu's little face. He couldn't bear to look away. He already knew that this was his child, but today, Rongyu knew that he was his father. Lan Yu wanted to cry in his heart. There was a kind of indescribable feeling. This kind of feeling was probably the same as how he felt when his father had him. He raised his eyes and looked at Qinshan. "Why didn't you tell me that he was my son earlier?" Qinshan was shocked. Then, she said very slowly, "I don't remember." Lan Yu's heart trembled. He looked at her. He thought that she knew that she was pregnant before she lost her memory. At that time, she was going to give birth to his child. Lan Yu's heart was very soft. He didn't say anything and just held her hand. Qinshin wanted to break free, but his grip was too firm. She could only let him be. Until she couldn't bear it anymore. She said, Lan Yu, I want to go to the bathroom. Lan Yu was a little disappointed and reluctantly let go of her. Qinshin heaved a sigh of relief, but after taking 2 steps, he turned his head back and was stunned. Wrong eyes, Shin said. Qin say it. Qin, Su. He was very gentle, and his eyes had the unique expression of a loving father. At least, it made Qinshin feel that this marriage was right for little Rongyu. She went into the bathroom and washed her face with cold water. When she came out, Rongyu had already been transfused and was lying quietly. Lan Yu kissed the little guy's hand and said softly, Look after him. I'll make some brown sugar pumpkin porridge for him. Qinshin was not proficient in these things, so she left it to him. The ward was a VIP room with all the facilities, but these things had to be bought in the supermarket outside. Lan Yu took 2 steps and then turned back to Qinshin. Give me some change. I left my wallet with you. Qinshin searched herself, but couldn't find it. Finally, she said, Pay with your phone. Lan Yu said lightly, I didn't tie it up. Chapter 3067. However, Lan Yu chose to take her phone away and left his own phone. I'll use yours. Call your own phone if you need anything. Before Qinshin could stop him, he left. Qinshin was speechless. The doctor came to check Xiao Rongyu's condition again. Fortunately, everything was fine. After the doctor left, Qinshin was a little bored, so she opened Lan Yu's phone. His phone was probably for personal use. There weren't many phone numbers saved, only a few dozen. The first one was her at Chunshin. Love Qinshin? Childish. She had completely forgotten how he had treated her in the past, but from the photos on his phone, it seemed like they had a very good time in the past. Qinshin looked at those photos as if she was looking at another person. She couldn't be immersed in it at all, and didn't think that it was her. She looked at the person in the photo, and it was very strange. She was such a feminine person, but she was once so masculine. No, it was not masculine, it was a man. Qinshin continued to scroll through the photos, looking at her and Lan Yu in the photos. Some intimate photos. She felt that it was a little painful to the eyes. It was clearly 2 men, but Lan Yu could also kiss a man. Qinshin deleted all the photos on his phone. She felt that since it was her, she had the right to do so. Lan Yu came back half an hour later. After seeing Xiao Rongyu, he made porridge for him. Qinshin changed the phone back. After a while, Lan Yu came over and asked, You deleted the photos? Yes, I deleted them. They were a little ugly. Qinshin said with concern. For a long time, he didn't speak. She couldn't help but ask him, What's wrong? Nothing. His voice became even fainter, and then he walked into the kitchen. Qinshin snorted and didn't care. However, no matter how much she didn't care, she couldn't ignore the fact that he was cold to her. After Xiao Rongyu woke up, his eyes fell on Xiao Rongyu, and he didn't look at her. Qinshin was a little angry. Why was he angry at her now? However, in front of the children, the adults would not quarrel. He quietly fed the little fellow porridge. Qinshin raised his hand to check the time. I'm going to buy lunch. Lan Yu suddenly said, Qinshin, do you still remember the fried chicken you used to eat? Qinshin froze for a moment. Lan Yu continued, he probably doesn't remember. Let's just buy something. Qinshin felt that he was really a little weird. It was probably menopause. Seriously, when he slept with a woman, he clearly had the body of a 20-year-old, but when he argued, he was a 50-year-old uncle. Of course, she ignored him and went to buy his least favorite dishes, wanting to disgust him a little. The moment Lan Yu opened his lunchbox, his face turned green. Little Rongyu knew that he didn't like to eat this. He looked at him nervously and asked, Dad, you don't like it? Lan Yu changed his expression and smiled faintly. I like it. I like everything your mother bought. You don't mean it? Little Rongyu stuck out his tongue. Lan Yu was angry in his heart, but seeing that the little fellow was better, his mood also improved. He reached out and rubbed his head. We'll go home in the afternoon. Xiao Rongyu was very happy, but Qinshin was a little neglected. It didn't feel good. In the afternoon, the doctor checked Xiao Rongyu and confirmed that he could be discharged. Lan Yu carried him out, and Xiao Rongyu was very happy. Chapter 3068. Lan Yu was sitting in the driver's seat. He looked at Qin Chun through the rearview mirror and said, "I accidentally fell down and bled a little." "It's nothing." Mr. Lan was angry. "What do you mean by it's nothing? Don't you feel pain when you didn't break your head?" Mr. Lan had forgotten about his son after he had a grandson. He said angrily, "I'll be right there." "Which hospital are you in?" Lan Yu said helplessly, "I'm out of the hospital. I'll be right there." "Okay, I'll be right there." Mr. Lan was determined. Lan Yu hung up the phone and started the car without saying anything. When he returned to the villa, Father Lan was already there. He hugged his precious grandson and gave him a good hug. Then, he scolded Lan Yu and Qin Chun. In the end, he asked, the child fell down. "Where are you?" Lan Yu rubbed his nose and said slowly, "Qin Chun and I are not at home." Father Lan was also an experienced person. When he heard this, how could he not understand? He was going to have fun. His poor eldest grandson. His parents wanted to have fun, so they left him at home. They were really heartless. Father Lan was so anxious that he even spouted out the heartless words. Mr. Lan thought about it carefully and decided to bring Rongyu to his side. Qin wanted to say something, but Lan Yu said it first. "Dad, I'll send Rongyu to your place after he recovers. However, he has to go to kindergarten in the fall. Qin and I still have to bring him back." Mr. Lan still accepted this point, so he went back after having a meal here. After Mr. Lan left, Lan Yu pulled the collar of his shirt and asked the servant, "Where's your wife?" "She's upstairs with the young master," the servant said respectfully. Lan Yu nodded. He took off his coat and walked upstairs slowly. He pushed open the door of the children's room and walked in. Qin Chun was looking after Rongyu with a gentle look. "Are you asleep?" He walked over and sat beside little Rongyu as he asked softly. Qin Chun grunted in acknowledgement, but he didn't look away. Lan Yu grabbed her hand. "Go to sleep. I'll keep watch." Qin Chun wanted to break free, but he couldn't. Instead, he was restrained by him. "Let go." Her voice was very low as she was afraid of waking Rongyu up. Lan Yu looked at her and said in a low voice, "Qin, weren't we on good terms before? Last night was wonderful. I'm so happy." He reached out and gently ruffled her hair. "Isn't it good if we do that forever?" "I was drunk last night," Qin said calmly. "That was just an illusion." Lan Yu narrowed his eyes. "So the pleasure you felt was also an illusion? You lying under me and telling me to hit harder was also an act?" Qin clenched his teeth. "If you forget this, I have a recording here. You can listen to it." Lan Yu kindly played the recording for her. Qin snatched it and glared at him. "You're crazy. Rongyu will hear it. He was made like this. Is there a problem?" Lan Yu said shamelessly. Qin turned his head away and took his phone back to the master bedroom. She did open it, but she couldn't find the recording he mentioned. It meant that she had been fooled by him, but she felt that there was something wrong with his strange behavior. Sure enough, he returned to the room after a while. He threw his coat beside her and lay on the soft bed. Qin looked at him. "Why did you lie to me? Why did you delete the photos?" Lan Yu covered his eyes with his hand. "Qin, do you think that you are qualified to delete those photos because they are you? But do you really think that you are Qin in your heart?" With that, he moved his hand away and looked at her quietly. Her heart was squeezed hard, but she didn't say anything. Lan Yu smiled faintly. "You are not. You have not been her for a long time." He covered his eyes again, as if he didn't want to see her. He was still angry. Qin knelt beside him and looked at him for a long time. Then she asked, "What about you? You said you love me. Then tell me, do you love the old me or the current me? Would you believe me if I said I love both?" Lan Yu smiled bitterly. "You won't believe me. You will think that I am a bastard because you have sacrificed so much, and I have always treated you like this." He reached out slowly, held her hand, and gently pulled her into his arms. His face was close to hers, and he said softly and slowly, "Qin, I have never touched them. Really, not even once." Chapter 3069. The kiss was full of pain. Then, he opened his eyes and looked at her. Qin Chen's eyes reflected his. At this moment, it was a little touching. Her fingers gently touched him, and she murmured, "Lan Yu, you haven't answered my question. I've said it before. I like both of you because in my heart, you are the same person, but you don't think so." He closed his eyes slightly. "Chun Chun, Huang Xia said that you love me, but we separated in such a hurry. At that time, I hated you. Even now, it doesn't feel real." He showed weakness and then hugged her tightly in his arms, as if he was afraid of losing her again. Qin Chen's face was pressed against his neck, and she asked in a low voice, "Are you very angry? Because I deleted the photos?" He murmured in a low voice. She frowned. "But I think it's so ugly. It's very embarrassing. So, no matter how angry you are, I still have to delete it." Her voice was a little childish. Lan Yu pulled her face and looked at it, frowning. "You think it's ugly?" "Yes, it's very ugly." She flipped her hair. "I like my current appearance." Lan Yu looked at her for a long time and suddenly laughed. He was a little surprised. Qin Chen actually hated the way she used to be. Then, he let go of her and snorted. "You used to admire your own appearance. Oh, I forgot to tell you. You used to work in Xingyuan, and a group of nurses liked you and chased after you." Just thinking about it made Qin Chen feel a little disgusted. She felt that Lan Yu was talking about a horror movie. After staring at him for a long time, he nodded at her. "It's true. Fortunately, the photos were deleted." Qin Chen felt that she had done the right thing. Lan Yu held her waist with one hand and took out his phone from his pocket with the other. He played with it a few times and said calmly, "Fortunately, the photos can still be found after Apple deleted them." After a few times, her photos were restored. Qin Chen was infuriated. She stared at his photo for a long time before looking at it again. "Lan Yu, then why are you so angry?" "The ritual of quarreling, Mrs. Lan." He kissed her hair to make it up. Qin Chen was still staring at him. His gaze softened as he kissed her eyes, her nose, and her lips bit by bit. Little by little, he kissed her gently in the end. After a long time, he whispered against her lips, "Qin Chen, you were drunk last night, but you're not drunk now." He only said half of the sentence, but she understood what he wanted. So she murmured, "So, do it once to prove that we've been together." His fingers stroked her red lips. "Prove that what happened last night wasn't an illusion." Qin Chen pulled his hand away. "You're very greedy." Yes, I am greedy, but I am greedy because I love you." He turned over and buried his face in her hair. He took a deep breath. "Qin Chen, tell me you love me." Qin Chen smiled helplessly. "But Lan Yu, I really don't have such a mood now. I'm sorry." He stared at her and pinched her chin with his fingers. "Mrs. Lan, you can't be so honest. This is one of my strengths." She was still smiling, but she refused his proposal. "I want to see Rong Yu." Chapter 3070. Qin Chen pressed him down and said, "Let me go. You just had your blood taken today." "Is that considered concern, Mrs. Lan?" His eyes were a little clear and a little flirtatious. Qin Chen sat up and flipped his long hair. "You think too much, Mr. Lan." Lan Yu smiled and let her leave. However, he still grabbed her hand when she got off the bed and whispered, "Sleep with Rong Yu for a while. Don't stay up like this." They had been playing for a whole night last night. She would also be tired. Qin Chen looked into his eyes and nodded before walking out. Lan Yu lay down alone, but he was a little excited because his relationship with her had eased. The more he lay down, the more he couldn't fall asleep. In the end, he sat up and secretly went to the children's room to see Qin Chen and Rong Yu. He said that he was going to see his son, but he stared at his son's mother for a long time. Little Rong Yu woke up. He blinked his eyes and called out softly, "Dad." His little face was a little shy because he saw that his father was looking at his mother very gently. His father must love his mother very much to show such a look. Lan Yu made a gesture and then moved to the other side. Little Rong Yu also turned over, and the two of them lay face to face. "Dad," the little guy called out sweetly again. Lan Yu reached out and touched his hair. He whispered, "How did you fall?" Little Rong Yu was a little embarrassed, and didn't want to say it. Lan Yu smiled faintly and patted his little head. You can tell me. I promise I won't tell anyone. Really? Pinky swear. Little Rong Yu said in a low voice. Lan Yu smiled. I promise. The little guy was usually very naughty and sharp-tongued. However, he was still a child after all, and he was also injured. He seemed particularly delicate and soft. He immediately nestled in Lan Yu's arms and said softly, I had a dream. I dreamed that my mother didn't want us anymore. When I woke up, I looked for her. She wasn't there, so I ran downstairs. As little Rong Yu spoke, he even peed. Lan Yu was both angry and happy at the same time. If you can't find your mother, you can ask the servants at home. Xiao Rongyu stopped talking. Lan Yu reached out and rubbed his little head to comfort him. After a while, little Rongyu asked in a low voice, Daddy, are you and Mommy together forever? Mom won't fly out again? Don't you like Mommy flying out? Lan Yu asked gently. Rongyu's little face was a little disappointed. I hope that Mummy will always be with me, but everyone says that I'm the smartest child, so I'm too embarrassed to bring it up. I'll be laughed at. Lan Yu burst into laughter. How could such a young child care so much about face? In this aspect, he seemed to be very similar to him. He thought about it and hesitated for a moment before saying, After this year, Daddy will try to talk to Mommy and let her stay at home all the time. Okay. Xiao Rongyu nodded obediently. Lan Yu's heart softened. He never dared to think that he could have a son, especially with Qin Shun. Moreover, he was born under such circumstances. He wanted to know a lot of things, but Qin Shun had forgotten. He would rather keep it a secret than force her to remember. It was not easy for her to come back. In his heart, he felt guilty towards her. He wanted to make it up to her, even though she still had the ability to make him angry. Lan Yu smiled slightly and carefully held the little guy in his arms. Go to sleep. Daddy is sleepy too. Chapter 3071. However, Xiao Rongyu did not know that. He suddenly became energetic. Daddy, I want to listen to stories. I want to go out and play. Lan Yu thought. Should this kid go back into Qin Shin's stomach and wait for a few years for another child to come out? Of course, Xiao Rongyu's body did not allow him to go out and play. However, Lan Yu told him stories for an hour. He was very tired. It was even more tiring than doing it with Qin Shan for the whole night. Of course, the fun was different. Lan Yu fell asleep. However, Xiao Rongyu's eyes were still wide open. He looked at this and that with a blissful expression on his face. He recuperated at home for a few days, and his wound was completely healed. When Papa Lan came to pick Xiao Rongyu up, he was reluctant. Papa Lan squatted down and looked at his eldest grandson. He said softly, Do you want Daddy and Mommy to give you a younger brother or sister? Xiao Rongyu's eyes lit up. A younger brother or sister? Yes. That's why Daddy and Mommy have to focus on making babies. If you're by the side, you won't have a younger brother or sister, Papa Lan said straightforwardly. Xiao Rongyu looked at him curiously. Why? Papa Lan coughed. It'll be inconvenient, but I've been sleeping with Daddy and Mommy these few days. I didn't disturb them. One night, when I woke up, Daddy was lying on Mommy's body. Mommy kept crying, Xiao Rongyu said innocently. Papa Lan's expression was a little interesting. He scolded his son in his heart. Initially, he sympathized with him and endured it. However, he felt that Lan Yu was simply a beast. He wouldn't even let go of his child. In order to prevent his grandson from being poisoned, Papa Lan felt that he had to take this eldest grandson away. At least, he couldn't let him go before school started. Of course, Papa Lan scolded Lan Yu when he saw him. He was probably shameless. Why couldn't he control himself? Lan Yu's reason was very good. Dad, I've endured it for too long. A man will go bad if he holds it in for too long. Papa Lan jumped up. Don't give me that. I haven't gone bad for so long. Lan Yu smiled. Dad, you still have that? Papa Lan blushed. I'm only in my early 60s. Papa Lan was a little sad. Xiao Rongyu hugged him and rubbed against him. Father Lan was a little sad. At this moment, Xiao Rongyu hugged his leg and rubbed against it. Father Lan lowered his head and looked at the little guy. He was in a good mood and smiled. He carried his grandson and walked outside. As he walked, he said, If you have the ability, give me a baby. Don't talk nonsense all day. And, Daddy, I have to about you. To Chin too. Lon. You. I have. Chin Zhao's. You. Moo. Lon too. Lon you. Not. Our Xiao. Lon. Not. Lon. He was old, and his only hope in this life was that Lon Yu could give him another cute little granddaughter. Thinking about it, little Rong Yu was about to go to school, and he couldn't play anymore. If Lon Yu didn't give him a little one, he would be very bored. Father Lon took the little fellow, dragged his suitcase, got into the car, and left. Chin came downstairs and frowned. Lon Yu, you agreed? Chapter 3072. It was mainly because Xiao Rong Yu hadn't grown up with him. If he had grown up by his side, Lon Yu's parenting philosophy would have been different. He looked at Chin Shun and smiled. Dad is doing this for our own good. Us? Chin Shun looked at him with a puzzled expression. Lon Yu put his hand on her shoulder and coughed. It's like this. Dad thinks we should have another child. It's best if it's a daughter. Chin Shun frowned. When you proposed to get married, you didn't say you wanted to have another child. I don't want to have one, she said in the end. Lon Yu smiled. But it's different now. He held her in his arms. I want a daughter like you. You're bored. Chin Shun sneered. Lon Yu, I said you don't have to say what you want to say next. Lon Yu grabbed her hand and very seriously led her upstairs. Chin Shun broke free from him. What are you doing? Giving birth to a child. My dad said, I'm just shooting blanks. Lon Yu looked serious. However, Chin Shun was furious. She frowned and looked at him. I'll have a job later. Stop fooling around. We're going to get married. What job do you have? Lon Yu said, unhappily. Chin Shun looked at him and pursed his lips. I'm going to shoot a commercial. I'll go with you, he said without thinking. Chin Shun reminded him, you have to go to Sea City. Sea City? Cece was in Sea City now, and Gu Zhe was married to her. A secret marriage. Cece was banished to Sea City, and Gu Zhe went to Sea City once a week. It seemed to be a blessing, but Lon Yu never felt that it was a kind of happiness. He felt that living a simple and pure life was what Cece should be. After seeing Cece's clear eyes, he had sworn to protect her for the rest of his life, but he broke his promise. He had underestimated the power of love. One Gu Zhe was enough to make her return to the dust. Lon Yu was reluctant, but he couldn't bear to see her. He was afraid that she wasn't living well, and he was afraid that Gu Zhe wouldn't treat her well. He was silent. Chin Shun asked, what are you thinking about? He looked at her. Cece. Chin Shun's expression changed slightly. Lon Yu held her hand. Cece and Gu Zhe are married. She was arranged to stay in Sea City. The word arrange made Chin Shun's eyebrows loosen. He subconsciously asked, why did Lin Cece's parents agree to it? This is clearly an unequal marriage. Cece likes it, Lon Yu said, holding Chin Shun's hand. Come with me to see her. Chin Shun looked at him and said slowly, she wouldn't want to see me. Would she? Lon Yu smiled. Of course not. As he said that, he reached out and stroked her hair. That's settled. I'll go to the study to deal with some business. Let's go to Sea City together tomorrow. Chin Shun smiled a little reluctantly. When he turned around to leave, he added, let's leave the baby making for tonight. I have a show to do in autumn and winter. Do you want me to do the show with a pregnant belly? Chin Shun looked at him. Lon Yu smiled and didn't say anything. Chin Shun didn't realize that she wasn't against pregnancy. She just wanted to finish the show. So that night, he took the initiative to use Tea City. When he lowered his body, she wrapped her arms around his neck. Don't you want a daughter? Lon Yu kissed the corner of her mouth as he did it. His voice was low and husky. If you want it, I'll get rid of it. Chin Shun gritted his teeth. You know? Chapter 3073. Chin Shun's body trembled. In the end, he still succeeded. Lon Yu had a good time. It was probably too rough, so Chin Shun ignored him for a long time. Of course, Lon Yu coaxed him for a whole night. Early the next morning, Chin Shun got up early and went to the locker room to pack his luggage. When Lon Yu woke up, there was nothing. Then he heard a slight sound coming from the locker room. He smiled faintly, got up, and opened the door. Shin was sorting out her clothes and putting them into the suitcase one by one. After she was done, she straightened up and looked up to see Lanyu. Then she opened the cabinet to see if there was anything else she wanted to bring. Lanyu hugged her from behind, buried his face in her hair, and said in a low voice, Shin, help me pack up. Huh? Pack up yourself. I'm not your babysitter. Shin snorted softly. Lanyu hugged her from behind, bit her neck, and said in a low voice, I exhausted myself last night, Mrs. Lan. Shin's face was a little red. She stared at him and struggled to break away. He was really holding her too tightly. Let me go. I'll help you pack up. She gave in. However, the shameless man still hugged her and said in a low voice, Shin, I'm sorry for what happened last time. Then he buried his face in her hair. I was just afraid that you would leave like before. I was very angry at that time. His palm tightened, and he hugged her tighter, holding her in his arms. Shin's heart was a little soft. She tilted her head and said, Lanyu? He smiled bitterly and pressed his face against her. I know you still blame me. You can't get over it. You married me just for Rongyu, but Shin, I want you to know that I will be a good husband and father. Lanyu said in a low voice. He didn't want her to answer and kept hugging her. After a long time, Shin whispered, Didn't you ask me to pack for you? How am I supposed to pack when you're hugging me like this? Lanyu smiled faintly and let go of her. He walked to the closet and pulled out a shirt and pants. He also took off his bathrobe in front of her. Shin closed his eyes. He smiled sheepishly. She's not a little girl anymore. You've seen her so many times already. Why are you making such a fuss? He said meaningfully. You used to be very bold and unrestrained. Nonsense. Shin snorted and glanced at him. Then, he helped him pack his luggage. He only packed a few shirts and trousers. Lanyu chuckled. Have you prepared any underwear? As he said this, he took out a few black bullet-shaped ones. Your favorite. Shin helped him put them into the suitcase. She snorted coldly. You're the one who's hot on the inside. Don't blame it on me. I'm hot on the inside because of you, he said naturally. Then he smiled and tidied up his clothes. He carried the luggage downstairs and asked Shin to pack up and go downstairs to have breakfast with him. When they had breakfast together, with 2 suitcases, the servants at home felt that the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Gu had become better. They were very harmonious, and they couldn't stop smiling. Shin said hesitantly, while eating breakfast, Lanyu, I want to discuss something with you. Lanyu looked at her. Go ahead. Chapter 3074. Lanyu finished the milk in the cup and smiled. Shin, do you think I'm your blood bank? No, she whispered. How about I take him with me? Lanyu put his hand on the back of her hand and said calmly, Shin, you're too nervous. Moreover, little Rongyu's blood type isn't rare, so it's not that dangerous. It's only a 2-hour drive from C City to B City. If something happens to Qingyi, I can call a helicopter and we'll be there in half an hour. Shin looked down and said nothing. Lanyu rubbed her hand and smiled. Shin, I will wait for you in the car. In fact, he wanted to smoke. He felt that Shin did not feel safe in her heart. Perhaps she did not regard him as a dependence in her heart. He did not force her, but dealt with it calmly. After putting the suitcase away, he sat in the car and smoked quietly. When he smoked the 3rd cigarette, Shin got in the car. She sat next to him, buckled the seatbelt, and looked at him. Are you really going to go with me? Lanyu put out the cigarette butt and said, I have contacted Sister Quan. By the way, I have upgraded your hotel to a presidential suite. Shin was a little angry. If you do this, others will say that I am arrogant. Don't you usually act arrogant? Lanyu put on his sunglasses and started the car. Shin was a little restrained and did not say anything. However, when she arrived at the hotel, Lanyu did not restrain himself. Because he saw the toy boy, Paging Yu. When he saw him, Paging Yu was sitting on the sofa in the lobby of the hotel, wearing sunglasses on his delicate face. He was wearing a pair of white pants and a black and white striped t-shirt, which was obviously a standard casual dress. Lanyu looked at him, then looked at his wife and asked in a low voice, Can you explain? Are you here to shoot a commercial or to meet your toy boy? Qinshin glared at him and threw the luggage at his feet. Whatever you think. She was so rude that Lan Yu was a little angry. Mrs. Lan, watch your attitude. He looked very much like a jealous husband or a husband caught in the act of adultery. Qinshin snorted and said, "What kind of attitude do you want? Should he admit his mistake or cry and beg for forgiveness? This is my job, Lan Yu. If you're not happy, you can leave." "You didn't tell me that you were filming a commercial with a gigolo," Mr. Lan insisted. Qinshin crossed his arms in front of him. "His name is Paging You, not a gigolo. Besides, I don't need your permission to cooperate with anyone, Mr. Lan. Besides, I didn't say anything when you came to see Lin Cece. It's because you don't love me that you don't care, right?" His gaze fell on her face, his eyes filled with heartache. Qinshin's breath stopped. "Lan Yu, if you want to quarrel, go ahead, but I won't accompany you." She really felt that she had married a madman. He could be tender and sweet in the morning, but now he was like this. At this moment, Qinshin hoped that he would explode on the spot. Lan Yu's face darkened. "Are you really going to ignore my feelings for a gigolo? You're being unreasonable." Qinshin pulled his suitcase and walked to the front desk. "Give me a room." She couldn't stand living with a man who was in menopause. Paging You came over at this time and smiled. "Did you quarrel? Do you want to squeeze with me? I have an executive suite. We can have one room each." Chapter 3075. "I don't care." Paging You smiled, but he saw Lan Yu walking over. He was very jealous. Paging You smiled and took a step back. "I won't bother you anymore. See you on set in the afternoon." Qinshin also smiled at him and then continued to register. The pen in his hand was rudely snatched away, and Lan Yu said to the receptionist, "Room 2118. The receptionist's eyes lit up. He was a guest in the presidential suite, and he was unreasonably handsome. So she smiled and handed over the room card. "Sir, please call us if you need anything." Lan Yu said very rudely, "Thank you, but I brought my wife. I'll look for her if I need anything." Qinshin was infuriated. Lan Yu took her hand and went to the suite. As soon as he put down the luggage, he began to interrogate her. "What's your relationship with Paging You?" Qinshin's eyes fell on her face, and he pursed his lips. "Whatever relationship you think it is." Lan Yu's expression was a little bad. Qinshin chuckled. "You don't believe me when I say it's a normal relationship, so it's up to you whether you believe me or not. If you don't believe me, you'll feel bad. It has nothing to do with me." As soon as she finished speaking, he picked her up and lifted her very high. She put her hand on his shoulder and hammered him. "Lan Yu, what are you doing? Are you crazy? What do you want?" The next second, she was thrown onto the luxurious bed, and his body immediately pressed down on her. Qinshin raised his head to look at his face. He was probably in a bad mood, so he didn't do anything to her. He just looked at her with his deep eyes. After a long time, he said, "Qinshin, you're not alone. Even if you help Paging You, there's a limit." Qinshin turned his face away. The company arranged it, so you just followed it? Or are you deliberately trying to piss me off?" Lan Yu pinched her face and said in a gentle voice, "I did. A sky-high penalty fee, CEO Lan." Qinshin said helplessly, "You have to think about me. I'll pay for it." Lan Yu sat up and was about to call Mo. Qinshin stopped him. She hugged his waist from behind and said in a low voice, "Lan Yu, don't." His hand stopped and he murmured, "Qinshin, why? Give me a reason." "Just work. Don't make a fuss about it," she murmured behind him. "I promise there won't be any kissing scene." "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse. Qinshin nodded. "I promise." Lan Yu didn't say anything more. He reached out and pulled her into his arms from behind. He lowered his head and kissed her for a while. Then he said in a low voice, "Take a break. I'll take you to lunch at noon." Qinshin blinked. Did he agree? Lan Yu pursed his lips and didn't say anything else. He just lay flat. After a while, Qinshin gently leaned into his arms. She didn't say anything and just leaned against him. Lan Yu's voice sounded quietly. "Don't think that I'll forgive you just like that." She put her hand flat on his chest and looked up at his handsome face. She chuckled. Actually, I didn't ask for your forgiveness. Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and stared at her. Qin Shen was still smiling, and then she buried her face. There was a sense of joy after teasing someone. Chapter 3076. Lan Yu looked down at her. What are you laughing at? I suddenly feel that you are very stupid, she said honestly. Lan Yu looked at her again and reached out to rub her soft long hair without saying anything. After a while, just as Qin Shen was about to fall asleep, Lan Yu suddenly said, "We agreed that there would be no kissing scenes." There was a trace of grievance in his voice. Qin Shen suddenly felt that it was funny. She smiled and leaned against his chest. I promise. However, it turned out that her promise was nothing. At noon, they got up and had lunch together. Lan Yu personally sent her to the set. Sister Quan was there too. She probably knew that Lan Yu was coming, so she specially came over to avoid trouble. Her assistant, Xiao Hong, also came over and waited on Qin Shen to the makeup room. Sister Quan and Lan Yu exchanged some pleasantries. At this time, Pei Jingyu came over. He was wearing a bathrobe. It was always very beautiful to see youth and flesh. Lan Yu frowned. What kind of advertisement is this? Does it need to be shot like this? He also saw a prop, a bathtub. It's a shower gel. But President Lan, don't worry. All the staff will be there during the whole process. There won't be any naked scenes. At most, Qin Shen will stand up from the bathtub. Sister Quan comforted him, but she was not optimistic. Lan Yu frowned. You mean standing up from the bathtub in a bathrobe? Was there any difference between that and not wearing clothes? His wife was going to be naked in front of the whole world? This was something that Lan Yu couldn't accept. Let me see the script. He frowned. Sister Quan sighed in her heart. Go and get it. When she got it, Lan Yu glanced through it and then said coldly, There will be a kissing scene? Damn it. How did that woman lie to him this morning? She promised that there would be no kissing scene. Now it was written in black and white. Sister Quan was afraid that he would misunderstand, so she quickly explained, It's a fake scene. Don't worry, President Lan. In fact, Sister Quan was having a mental breakdown. Which female artist hadn't done a kissing scene before? It was all real, not to mention that it was just a fake scene. It wasn't a big deal to come out of the water wearing a bathrobe. A thicker one wouldn't expose you. Besides, Qin Shen's underwear had been to many shows. Even if Boss Lan wanted to haggle over it now, he wouldn't be able to do it. Sister Quan thought to herself. Then, Lan Yu started to edit the script. Of course, he would not change it. Instead, he immediately called a senior screenwriter over. The face of the director of the commercial turned green. How could they continue filming this commercial? The changes were so unattractive. Even if the commercial went in, there wouldn't be any splashes. The director was having a headache, but he did not dare to offend CEO Lan. When Qin Shen came out, she looked at the script and her face turned green. Lan Yu, you're so lame. This is my job. She thought that they had already communicated with each other, but he was still so unreasonable. She simply didn't want to deal with him. Qin Shen's temper was not to be trifled with. She looked at Lan Yu and said, If you continue to be like this, there's no need for our marriage to exist anymore. Lan Yu snorted. Do you think I can just watch you and that pretty boy get married? Qin Shen didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Lan Yu, can you be a little more reasonable? He snorted softly. There's no way to be reasonable. Chapter 3077. Lan Yu looked at her and said, Qin Shen, are you serious? Qin Shen nodded and said, yes. Lan Yu sighed and said, okay, I'll go see her. In fact, if he were to watch Qin Shen and the gigolo kissing each other, he would really suffer from internal injuries, and he didn't want to die young. Of course, he was angry, but he also knew that if he continued to make things difficult for her, Qin Shen would explode. This time, he cherished their reconciliation a lot more than last time. Although he shouted fiercely, he didn't dare to do anything to her. Lan Yu's concession was unbelievable in everyone's eyes. After all, he had asked to change the script just now. But although it was unbelievable, the director and Sister Quan were relieved that they had finally sent him off. After Lan Yu left, Paging you came over and said, Sister Chin-chun, how did you convince him? I won him over by virtue. Chin-chun forced a fake smile and said, let's shoot the commercial. Paging you cooperated with the director's request and whispered, you fell in love with him and decided to manage your marriage? That doesn't seem like your style. Chin-chun smiled faintly and said, people's minds change, don't they? A trace of coldness flashed across Paging Yu's eyes. It seemed that Chin-chun had really decided to live well with Lan Yu. Women were always soft-hearted, and Chin-chun was no exception. While the commercial was being filmed, Lan Yu got into his car. Before starting the car, he called Chin-chun. The content was quite childish. It was nothing more than not allowing her to do the kissing scene. At most, she would fake the scene, and he would watch it carefully. Don't try to lie to me. Chin-chun was speechless and hung up. But when they were filming the kissing scene, she really couldn't kiss Paging Yu's handsome face anymore. It was probably because Lan Yu's words had a certain deterrent effect on her. Chin-chun laughed. Paging Yu looked at her and laughed, but only he knew that his laughter was different from Chin-chun's. Chin-chun felt sad because he thought of Lan Yu, and he felt sad because of bitterness. On the other side, Lan Yu hung up and started the car. It took about an hour to drive from the set to Lin Cici's villa. When Lan Yu arrived, it was almost evening. The black carved door was closed. Lan Yu got out of the car and greeted the guard. The guard immediately said, I have to ask Mr. Gu. Lan Yu took out a cigarette and lit it. He took a puff and wanted to slap Gu Zhe to death. Looking around, it was a high-end villa area, but how far was it from C City and B City? Was it really okay for Cici to stay here and not interact with others? Gu Zhe came once a week. Other than physical interaction, what else could he do? Lan Yu knew how busy a person like Gu Zhe was. He was definitely no less busy than himself. It was already good enough that he took one day a week. It was absolutely impossible for him to come and talk about love. In the long run, what would Cici become? To put it nicely, she would be his wife. To put it bluntly, was there any difference between her and a rich man's woman outside? No, there was. Women outside would still make trouble, but Cici wouldn't. When there was a problem, she would probably hide and cry secretly. No matter how angry Lan Yu was, he had to wait for Gu Zhe's reply. After hanging up the phone, the guard became respectful and said with a smile, Mr. Lan, I'm sorry. Mr. Gu said you can go in. Lan Yu cursed under his breath, got into the car, and drove into the villa. He opened the car door and took out a lot of food from the trunk. It was for Cici. Chapter 3078. Lan Yu walked into the hall. The hall was very grand. It should be said that the entire villa was grand inside and out. But there was no human touch, because there was no male owner here. The male owner only came back occasionally. Sometimes, when he was busy on the weekends or on a business trip, Gu Zhe probably didn't have time to care about this place. As for Cici, she could only keep waiting. Lan Yu's feelings were complicated. Cici was like a sister to him, or even a daughter. But now, she had to exhaust her incomplete life to wait for someone who might not be able to accompany her to the end. Lan Yu really wasn't sure if he had been wrong back then. Had he agreed too easily? If he hadn't agreed, Cici might not have been so stubborn. He knew that Cici's parents didn't interact much with Cici. It wasn't because they didn't want to see Cici, but because they were worried about Gu Zhe. Gu Zhe was a reputable figure. If he had anything to do with a family that had just stepped down, it would definitely affect him. Lan Yu's heart was a little cold. He stopped in his tracks and saw Cici. Cici was sitting on the sofa with an auntie who was teaching her how to knit. There was a faint and satisfied smile on Cici's little face. Lan Yu thought that perhaps Cici was happy with this kind of life because she was looking forward to it. But even so, he still couldn't bear it. Lan Yu called Cici's name softly. Lin Cici looked up. Gu Zhe? When she saw that it was Lan Yu, she quickly ran over and jumped to hug Lan Yu. Why are you here? I'm so happy that you're here. She was incoherent, but she was extremely cute. Lan Yu could feel her happiness and couldn't help hugging her and spinning her around. You seem to have lost weight. When he put her down, Lin Cici puffed up her cheeks. Because I missed you. Her gaze was a little timid. Brother Lan, are you still angry? Lan Yu felt sour and bitter. This little fool could actually remember that he was angry. How could he be angry at her now? Lan Yu smiled and pointed at the things on the side. These are for you. She was a foodie after all. She immediately went to have a look and even opened a packet to eat. Her face was full of satisfaction. Lan Yu smiled and walked to the sofa to pick up the sweater she had knitted. It was quite ugly. The auntie said with a smile, "It's for Mr. Gu. I'll go get you some water." The auntie had been here for a long time and knew that only people close to Mr. Gu could enter. Judging from Cece's appearance, she was probably very familiar with him. Speaking of Cece, Annie felt that it was quite a pity. She was so pretty, but why was her brain so bad? She was cute, but Sir never allowed her to get pregnant. He probably had other plans. The Annie went to pour some water. Lan Yu looked at it for a long time and smiled faintly. "Cece, knit one for me one day." "Okay." "Sure." Cece held the snacks in her arms and nibbled on them like a little mouse. She peeked at him and said, "But you have to bring me something delicious." Lan Yu laughed. At this moment, the Annie came over with a cup of good tea. Lan Yu wasn't in the mood to drink it. He just kept Lin Cece company. She looked very happy, very happy. Lan Yu couldn't help but ask the Annie beside him, "Did Cece's parents come?" The Annie was stunned and then sighed. "They rarely come. They only see each other once in 2 or 3 months. They seem to be very wary of Mr. Gu." Lan Yu knew about this, but he thought that it wasn't the only reason. The main reason was that Gu Zhe didn't like others to accept Lin Cece. Chapter 3079. After the Annie finished speaking, Lan Yu's heart felt even worse. He looked at Cece, and Cece tried her best to give him a smile. That smile made him feel very sad. She seemed very sensible, but careful. As Lan Yu looked at her, the little fool ran over and leaned on the floor beside him, continuing to eat snacks. She and Lan Yu were used to fooling around, so she was not surprised. But that did not mean that Gu Zhe would be happy to see it. Gu Zhe magically appeared in the villa, unlike the usual weekend exceptions. The black limousine stopped at the parking lot outside, and Gu Zhe slowly got out of the car, carrying a few boxes of delicious food in his hands. Passing through the door, he saw his little wife leaning on Lan Yu. Lan Yu was stroking her little head, and his little fool was smiling contentedly. She squinted her eyes and smiled at Lan Yu, looking very happy. Gu Zhe stopped in his tracks. He looked straight at her little face and suddenly remembered that she had not smiled so happily for a long time. She used to say that she liked him very much and that she liked to be with him. So when he said marriage, the little fool agreed. After getting married, she was happy for a long time, but slowly, she stopped smiling and always looked at him with a cautious gaze. Of course, she still liked him, but this liking became very conservative. She had always been a little scheming, and he always thought that these little scheming were very cute. But when a husband realized that his wife only smiled at other men, he did not think that she was cute anymore. It was a little hateful. Gu Zhe stood there, gently unbuttoning his suit, took off his coat, and put it on his arm, waiting for her to notice him. Lin Cece only noticed him after a minute, and the smile on her face disappeared. Gu Zhe saw a hint of panic in her eyes, and then she stood up. "You're back." Gu Zhe handed his coat to the servant beside him and opened his arms. Lin Cece hesitated for a moment, then ran over and hugged him. Gu Zhe kissed her forehead and asked gently, "Have you been good?" His little fool nodded vigorously. "Yes, yes, if you don't believe me, you can ask Annie." As she spoke, she winked at the aunt. Gu Zhe actually saw it, but he pretended not to see it. He just let go of her and sat on the sofa. "I brought your favorite osmanthus cake." After saying that, he looked forward to seeing her happy face. However, Lin Cece didn't look happy at all. Instead, she said very slowly, "Lan Yu brought me some too. I'm already full." Gu Zhe looked at Lan Yu. He was a man, so he naturally wouldn't fuss over such a small matter. He only said indifferently, "Then leave it for later." The little fool happily squinted his eyes and smiled. At this time, Lan Yu asked with some dissatisfaction, "Gu Zhe, do you have to do this? I just came to see you. You came all the way here just to put on a show for me? Was it a public display of affection?" Do you think you're the only one with a wife? Gu Zhe smiled lightly. Lan Yu, you're treating me like an outsider. He paused for a moment. I have to thank you on behalf of Cece for coming all the way here to see her. Lan Yu's eyes were a little cold, but he restrained himself with Cece around because the little fool was already looking over. Chapter 3080. Lin Cece nodded with a dazed expression, but she had always listened to him and quickly ran out. She looked like a child when she ran out. She was still the same as before, but in Lan Yu's eyes, there was bitterness. He had taken care of Cece for so long, and he knew her personality the best. She loved freedom so much. Every time she wanted to come out, she would purposely set fire to the nursing home in exchange for a few months of time outside. But here, she was willing to lose her freedom for Gu Zhe. This kind of love, this kind of sacrifice, Gu Zhe might not understand. Gu Zhe's heart would be like everyone else's. By marrying Cece, he would be responsible for her. But what did Cece do wrong? She liked Gu Zhe, but she had no obligation to lose her freedom for this love. She didn't understand, but Lan Yu felt it was not worth it for her. Lan Yu watched Cece's back quietly and said lightly, Gu Zhe, do you think Cece is happy? Gu Zhe held up a cup of tea. Lan Yu could see that Cece had just drunk it. He looked at Gu Zhe without batting an eyelid as he took a sip. Gu Zhe finished drinking and put down the cup. He smiled. Are you happy? Cece and I are married. Lan Yu sneered. Why did you exile her so far away? Gu Zhe, if you think marrying her is embarrassing, then don't marry her. I can take care of her for the rest of her life. Gu Zhe lowered his eyes and looked at the half-bitten osmanthus pastry at the side. He said slowly, Do you think I despise her? What else? Gu Zhe gritted his teeth and stared straight at Gu Zhe. Gu Zhe smiled lightly. I'm a little curious. Why didn't you come to me to reason with me before? But now, although he said this, he didn't seem to want an answer from Lan Yu. He continued, Have you ever thought that she will be disturbed in B City? She won't be able to face those things for long. She will be frightened by the reporters. Do you think the overwhelming reports will be good for Cece? Gu Zhe, you are her husband. You should protect her. Lan Yu said coldly, Don't make excuses for yourself. You're just afraid of trouble. You think she's an idiot, so all you have to do is push her far away. She won't be able to hear those nasty words, and you think the world is too flat? Gu Zhe, you really have a good plan, but what if one day Cece remembers everything and she returns to her original self? Do you think you can still live this kind of life with her? Or do you think you could just bring her back to B City? Gu Zhe narrowed his eyes. Lan Yu sneered. Love doesn't come so easily, Gu Zhe. Do you think you can hide your marriage from your parents and the media? Let me tell you, the bigger your company is, the more likely Cece will be exposed. Do you choose to protect the stock price or your wife? You don't have to answer me. You just have to know the answer in your heart. Gu Zhe's voice was low. It seems that you are here for the trial today? No. Lan Yu's voice was very low. I just hope Cece can live well. That's all. Gu Zhe was about to say something when he saw Lin Cece standing at the door with a cautious look on her face. His heart felt a stab of pain, and he calmly asked her to come over. His little fool walked over very slowly. She didn't stick to him like before. She said softly, I brought the food upstairs. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.